I have been a real estate photographer for almost 12 years now. It is quiet work most of the time. I drive to empty houses, unlock the door, take pictures of kitchens and bedrooms, and then leave. Most homes feel the same after a while. Clean walls, quiet rooms, the smell of paint or carpet. People often think it must be boring. But I like the silence. Empty houses have their own kind of calm. When no one is there, you notice small things. The way sunlight falls across the floor, the sound of wind moving through trees outside, the soft creak of a building settling. You start to feel like the house is breathing slowly around you. Most of the time, nothing strange happens. But sometimes a house feels different. That morning started like any other day. I was sitting at the small desk in my apartment, going through emails while drinking coffee that had already gone cold. Outside my window, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. It looked like rain would start soon. My phone buzzed with a new message from a real estate agent I had worked with before. Her name was Karen. She sent me photography jobs every few weeks. The email was short. She said she needed photos of a property before the weekend. It was cheap, she explained. Very cheap for the area, but the listing needed good pictures if they wanted anyone to even consider buying it. She attached the address. Willow Lane. I remember staring at that street name for a moment. It sounded familiar, though I couldn't remember why. Karen added one more sentence at the end of the message. No one has been able to sell this place for years. That was all she wrote. I checked the map. The house was about 40 minutes outside town, in a quiet area where roads curved through old neighborhoods and patches of forest. The listing price was strange. The house was large, 2 floors, a big yard. And yet it was cheaper than small apartments in the city. That alone should have been enough to make me curious. Still, strange listings happen all the time. Old homes need repairs. Some sit on the market for months before someone finally buys them. I replied to Corinne and said I could photograph it that afternoon. She sent the lockbox code and wished me luck. That last part felt a little unusual. By noon, I packed my camera gear into the back seat of my car and started the drive. The farther I went from town, the quieter the roads became. Stores disappeared, traffic faded, houses became older and farther apart. Some had tall trees growing close to the road, their branches stretching over the pavement like dark arms. The sky grew darker as clouds moved in. When I finally turned onto Willow Lane, the street was almost completely empty. Only a few houses stood along the road, each sitting on wide pieces of land with thick grass and tall fences. Some looked lived in, others looked forgotten. The address Karen gave me was near the end of the street. I saw the house before I even checked the number. It stood alone at the far corner, half hidden behind overgrown bushes and trees that had not been trimmed in years. The place was bigger than I expected. 2 stories tall, pale siding that had faded with age, a wide porch running across the front, several windows staring out toward the road. From a distance, it looked almost normal. But as I pulled into the cracked driveway, I noticed the small signs of neglect. The grass had grown high around the yard. The paint on the porch railings was peeling. One shutter hung slightly crooked beside an upstairs window. Still, the structure itself looked solid. It didn't look like a house that should be this cheap. I turned off the car and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. No dogs barking. No cars passing. Just the wind moving slowly through the trees. Something about the place made me hesitate before getting out. I told myself that was silly. I grabbed my camera bag and walked up the front steps. The wooden porch creaked under my weight. Near the door, a small metal lockbox hung from the handle, just like Corinne had said. I entered the code she gave me and opened it. Inside was a single brass key. Cold rain began to fall as I slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a slow, heavy sound. The air inside the house felt cool and still. There was a faint smell of dust and something older beneath it, the kind of smell buildings get when they sit closed for a very long time. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The silence was deeper indoors. My footsteps echoed softly across the wooden floor. The entryway opened into a large living room with tall windows that let in pale gray light from outside. Dust floated in the air like tiny drifting particles. The furniture was gone, but the room didn't feel completely empty. Sometimes when you walk into a house, you can tell people used to live there. You imagine where couches once stood, where families sat, where voices filled the air. This house felt like it still remembered those things. I set my camera bag on the floor and slowly walked through the rooms, planning the order of the photos. Living room first, then the kitchen, then the dining area. Everything seemed normal at first. Just an old house, waiting for someone to fix it up. But after a few minutes, I began to notice something strange. Some parts of the house looked untouched for years. Dust covered the floor near the walls. Cobwebs stretched across corners of the ceiling. Yet other spots looked cleaner. The kitchen counter had only a thin layer of dust. One section of the hallway floor looked recently walked on. I crouched down and ran my finger across the wood. The dust there was disturbed. Not much, just enough to suggest movement. I told myself it was probably the last person who came to inspect the house, maybe another agent or a contractor. Still, Karen had said no one had managed to sell the place in years, which meant it likely hadn't been shown very often. I continued working, setting up my tripod and taking the first photos of the living room. The camera shutter clicked quietly in the empty house. Clicking, clicking, clicking. Each sound seemed to linger in the silence. After finishing the downstairs rooms, I carried my gear toward the staircase. The steps creaked softly as I climbed. The second floor hallway stretched long and narrow, with several closed doors on both sides. A faint draft moved through the hall, stirring the dust near the floor. I started opening doors one by one. The first room was empty. The second room was empty too. But the third door didn't open all the way. Something behind it stopped it from swinging fully inward. I pushed gently. The door moved a few inches, then stopped again. That was when I noticed something strange. The air coming from inside the room felt warmer. Not by much, but enough that I could feel it against my face. And the smell inside the room was different. Less dust. More like someone had been there recently. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, my hand resting on the door. The house around me remained completely still. No wind. No footsteps. Just silence. Then slowly, carefully, I pushed the door a little farther open. And that was the moment I realized something that didn't make sense. The room behind the door looked lived in. The first thing I noticed about the room was the bed. It sat against the far wall beneath a narrow window, and unlike the rest of the house, the blanket on it was not covered in dust. The fabric looked slightly wrinkled, like someone had slept there not very long ago. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking. The rest of the hallway behind me felt cold and empty, but the air inside this room felt different. Not warm exactly, just less stale. Like the air had been moving. The door could only open halfway because something heavy was resting behind it. I leaned forward and pushed a little harder. The door creaked slowly until it pressed against a wooden chair that had been placed just behind it. That was strange. Not impossible, but strange. If someone placed the chair there from inside the room, it would block the door from opening outward, almost like they had wanted privacy. Or maybe they had wanted to keep someone out. I stepped around the chair and walked inside. My footsteps sounded softer here. The carpet on the floor looked newer than the flooring downstairs. Not brand new, but definitely cleaner than the rest of the house. The window above the bed had thin curtains that moved slightly in the breeze. That confused me at first, because when I walked through the house earlier, every window downstairs had been closed. I glanced up. The window here was cracked open, just an inch or two. Rain from outside tapped gently against the glass. For a moment I simply stood there, listening to the sound of it. Then I slowly turned in a circle, looking at the room more carefully. There was a small wooden dresser against one wall. A narrow desk sat in the corner. The surfaces were not spotless, but they didn't have the thick dust I had seen everywhere else. Someone had wiped them at some point. Maybe recently. I walked over to the dresser and placed my camera bag on the floor beside it. My fingers ran across the top surface. Only a thin layer of dust came away on my skin. Downstairs, the dust had been thick enough to leave clear marks when I touched things. Here it was different. I tried to think of a normal explanation. Maybe the last owner had lived in this room before the house was abandoned. Maybe they cleaned this area before leaving. But Karen had said the house had been sitting unsold for years. Years? Even a clean room gathers dust in that much time. I opened one of the dresser drawers. Inside was nothing but an empty space and the faint smell of old wood. The second drawer was the same. The third drawer slid open more slowly. That one contained something. A single folded blanket. It looked newer than everything else in the house. I lifted it carefully. The fabric felt soft, not stiff like old cloth that had been sitting untouched for years. It smelled faintly of detergent. That smell made my chest feel tight for some reason. Laundry soap. Fresh. I folded the blanket again and placed it back inside the drawer. Then I closed it. My eyes moved slowly across the room again. The bed, the chair behind the door, the slightly open window, and then something else caught my attention. On the desk in the corner sat a glass, just a plain drinking glass. There was a small amount of cloudy water sitting at the bottom. I walked over and stared at it. Dust had not settled inside the glass, which meant the water had not been there very long. I felt the first real sense of unease then. Not panic, just a quiet feeling that something was wrong. Because if someone had been here recently, that meant one of two things. Either the house wasn't as abandoned as everyone believed, or someone had been entering it without anyone knowing. I looked toward the hallway again. Still silent. The rain outside grew a little heavier. The steady tapping on the window glass was almost calming. I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe another photographer had come before me. Maybe an inspector stayed here while working on the property. Still, something about the room didn't feel temporary. It felt lived in. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress sank slightly under my weight. And that was when I noticed something else. The blanket beneath my hand felt warm. Not hot, just slightly warm. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it. But when I placed my palm flat against the fabric again, the warmth was still there, like someone had been lying there earlier that day. I slowly stood back up. My heart had started beating faster, though I tried not to let my mind run too far ahead. Houses can hold heat. Sunlight can warm a mattress through a window. There were explanations. There had to be. Still, I picked up my camera and began taking pictures of the room anyway. The job had to be done. The shutter clicked softly, as I moved around the space. Clicking, clicking, clicking. Each photo captured the strange contrast between this room and the rest of the house. Clean surfaces, unwrinkled curtains, the glass of water, the neatly folded blanket. When I finished, I lowered the camera and listened. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the rain. Then something faint reached my ears. A sound from somewhere deeper in the house. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then I heard it again. A slow creaking noise. Like wood shifting under weight. Footsteps. Very soft. Very slow. And definitely coming from below. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Silence returned. I waited there for almost a full minute, staring toward the hallway. Nothing moved. No shadows crossed the floor. No doors opened. Finally, I told myself it was just the old house settling. Wood expands and contracts when weather changes. Rain can make floors shift. That happens in older buildings all the time. Still, I suddenly felt very aware of how alone I was inside that house. Or at least how alone I was supposed to be. I packed my camera back into the bag. Before leaving the room, I glanced at the bed one more time. That warmth I felt earlier had started to fade. The blanket looked completely still now. Just another object in an empty house. I stepped into the hallway and pulled the door closed behind me. The chair scraped softly against the floor as the door pressed against it again. I didn't bother trying to move it back. Something about that chair made me uneasy. Like it had been placed there for a reason. The hallway lights were off, so the only illumination came from the gray daylight filtering through windows at the far end. The house felt darker now. Quieter. I walked slowly toward the stairs. Each step of the floor creaked under my weight. And the entire time, I couldn't stop thinking about that glass of water, the clean desk, the open window, and the warmth of the bed. Someone had been using that room. Not years ago. Recently. Maybe even today. When I reached the staircase, I paused and listened again. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then very faintly, I heard another sound from the first floor. Not footsteps this time. Something softer, like a door moving slowly on old hinges. And the strange thing was, I didn't remember leaving any doors open downstairs. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, the house had become very quiet again. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. For a moment, I just stood there in the entryway, listening. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Wind moved through the trees outside. The old wood of the house creaked now and then, the way old houses often do. But the sound I thought I heard before, the slow movement of a door, had stopped. I looked around the first floor carefully. Nothing had changed. The living room still sat empty and gray in the fading daylight. The kitchen doorway remained open just the way I left it. The hallway leading toward the back of the house looked still and untouched. I walked slowly through each room again, checking. Everything looked exactly the same. No doors had moved. No windows had opened. No signs that anyone else had been there. Eventually, I let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Old houses make strange noises. That was something I had learned years ago. Pipes shift, floors settle, wind presses against the walls. Sometimes the sounds can almost feel human. But that doesn't mean they are. I decided to finish the rest of the photos before it got too dark. The rain outside had thickened into a steady curtain, and the clouds were making the evening arrive earlier than usual. The gray light coming through the windows had begun to fade. I set up my tripod again in the living room. The camera shutter echoed softly each time I took a picture. Clicking, clicking, clicking. The sound felt small inside the wide, empty space. As I moved from room to room, I noticed something strange about the house. It didn't feel as cold as it should have. Most abandoned homes carry a deep chill in the air, especially when rain is falling outside. But this house held a steady temperature. Not warm, just lived in. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted. I finished the kitchen photos and stepped into the dining room. The room had large windows facing the backyard. Outside, the trees swayed slowly in the wind, their dark branches brushing against each other. The light had grown dim enough that I turned on my small camera light. A soft white glow filled the room. For a while I worked quietly, adjusting angles, capturing wide shots of empty corners, photographing details like door frames and stair railings. The whole time the house remained silent, almost peaceful. Eventually, I packed my gear and sat down on the bottom step of the staircase to check the images on my camera screen. Everything looked good. Clean shots, good lighting, nothing unusual. Just another empty house. I remember thinking that maybe the strange feeling earlier had simply been my imagination. Being alone in quiet places can do that sometimes. You start to hear things that aren't really there. You start to notice details that don't matter. Your mind fills in the rest. I stood up and stretched my arms. The rain outside had grown softer again. For a moment, I thought about heading upstairs one more time to take a few evening shots of the hallway. Sometimes real estate agents like darker interior photos for contrast. I picked up my camera, and that was when I heard it. A slow sound from above me. A single step. Very faint, but clear enough that I knew exactly what it was. Footsteps. I froze halfway up the staircase. My hand tightened around the camera. For several seconds, there was nothing else. Just silence again. My mind immediately searched for a reasonable explanation. Maybe something had fallen upstairs. Maybe a loose board had shifted because of the rain. But the sound had been too clear, too slow, like someone taking a careful step. I waited, listening. My eyes remained fixed on the dark hallway at the top of the stairs. Then it happened again. Another step, this one slightly heavier. A long creak from the floorboards above. My chest tightened. There was no doubt in my mind now. That sound was coming from the second floor. And the problem with that was simple. I was supposed to be the only person in the house. I stayed perfectly still on the stairs, barely breathing. Maybe, just maybe, someone else had entered the house while I was downstairs. A neighbor, another agent, even someone curious exploring the property. That was possible. But if someone had come in, they would have had to walk right past me in the living room. There was no other entrance I had seen. The rain continued tapping gently against the windows. Then the footsteps came again. This time 2 in a row. Slow, heavy, moving across the upstairs floor. The sound made the wooden beams in the ceiling groan softly. It felt deliberate, not random, not the shifting of old wood. Someone was walking. Upstairs, I felt a cold wave move through my chest. My mind returned instantly to the bedroom I had discovered earlier. The one that looked lived in. The warm bed. The glass of water. The open window. Maybe the person who used that room had come back. Maybe they had been upstairs the whole time. Watching, listening, waiting. The thought made my stomach twist. I slowly lifted my foot and stepped back down the staircase. The wood creaked under my weight. The footsteps above me stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt deeper than before, almost aware, like the house itself had begun listening. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Me on the staircase, and whoever or whatever was standing upstairs. Finally, I cleared my throat and spoke out loud. "Hello." My voice sounded small in the empty house. No answer came, just the quiet hum of wind outside. I tried again. "Is someone here?" Still nothing. Then very slowly, I heard another step above me, but this time it sounded different. Closer, much closer, right above the staircase. The floorboard groaned directly over my head, as if someone had walked to the top of the stairs and stopped there, waiting, listening, standing only a few feet above me. I stared up at the dark ceiling. The camera in my hand felt heavier than usual, and in that long, quiet moment, I had the strange and uncomfortable feeling that whoever was upstairs knew I was there and had known the entire time. I didn't stay much longer in that house after the footsteps stopped. Something about the silence that followed felt wrong, too heavy, too watchful. For a while I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up into the darkness of the hallway above me. I kept expecting someone to appear, a face, a shadow, a person leaning over the railing. But nothing ever moved. Eventually, I convinced myself that leaving was the smart thing to do. Maybe someone had been living in the house without permission. Maybe they didn't want to be seen. Maybe they were hiding upstairs, waiting for me to go. And honestly, that explanation felt easier than the other possibilities my mind had started to imagine. So I packed my camera gear quickly. The sound of my bag zipper felt loud in the quiet living room. Before leaving, I glanced once more toward the staircase. Still nothing. The hallway above remained dark and still. But I could not shake the feeling that someone was standing up there, watching me from the shadows. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, but the air outside felt cold and damp. The trees along the road moved slowly in the wind, their branches whispering together. I walked down the steps and reached my car. Only then did I finally feel my shoulders relax. Once the engine started and the headlights cut across the driveway, the house looked different. From the outside, it seemed quiet again. Empty, just another old place slowly falling apart. I told myself the strange feeling would pass. It usually did. But that night, after I returned home and started reviewing the photos on my computer, something else happened. Something I still think about. Something that made the entire experience feel much worse. I uploaded the images from my camera the way I always did. Room by room, living room, kitchen, dining area. The photos looked normal, clean angles, good lighting, empty spaces. Then the upstairs hallway photos appeared. The long, narrow corridor, closed bedroom doors, the dusty carpet stretching toward the window at the end. Nothing unusual there either. Next came the photos of the strange bedroom. The one that looked lived in. The bed, the desk, the glass with the cloudy water inside. Even on the screen, the room still looked different from the rest of the house. Cleaner, used. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. For a moment, I wondered if I should tell Corinne about it. If someone was staying in that house illegally, the property owner probably needed to know. Before I sent any emails, though, I decided to finish reviewing the rest of the images. There were a few more shots of the living room that I had taken later in the evening. The camera light had made the walls look slightly darker. I clicked through them slowly. Photo after photo of the empty room appeared on the screen. Then I stopped. One image looked wrong. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but the longer I stared at it, the more the shape began to make sense. The photo showed the living room from the far corner. The staircase was visible in the background, and near the bottom of the stairs behind me, there was something standing there. I leaned closer to the screen. My chest tightened. The shape looked like a person. Tall, still, standing halfway between the staircase and the hallway. The figure was blurry, as if it had moved slightly while the photo was taken, but the outline was clear enough to recognize. Shoulders, arms, a head tilted slightly to one side. It was someone standing in the room behind me, watching. For a long time, I just stared at the screen, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe the camera light had created a strange shadow. But the shape didn't look like a shadow. It looked solid, like a person. And the worst part was something I slowly realized as I studied the photo more closely. The angle of the shot told me exactly when it had been taken. It was one of the final pictures I captured before sitting down on the staircase to review my camera, which meant something very simple. When I was standing in that room, alone, taking photographs of the empty house, someone had been standing only a few feet behind me. Quiet, still, watching. A cold feeling moved through my body. My mind replayed the memory of the footsteps upstairs, the slow creaking boards, the pause at the top of the staircase. I zoomed in on the photo. The figure became more distorted, the pixels stretching across the screen. But one detail stood out clearly. The head of the figure was tilted slightly forward, as if the person had been leaning closer to see what I was doing. Looking directly at the camera, looking directly at me. I closed the photo quickly. My hands were shaking more than I wanted to admit. That night I barely slept. The image kept replaying in my mind. The empty house, the warm bed upstairs, the glass of water, the footsteps above me, and the silent figure standing behind me while I worked. The next morning, I called Corinne. I told her something strange had happened at the property. I mentioned the bedroom that looked used. I even told her someone might be staying there without permission. There was a long pause on the phone. Then she said something that made the entire situation feel worse. She told me the reason the house had been sitting unsold for so many years. Apparently, a family used to live there. A couple and their young daughter. About 20 years ago, they disappeared. All three of them. No one ever found out what happened. Police searched the house several times back then, but nothing was discovered. Eventually, the case went cold. Since then, the property had passed between different owners, but no one ever stayed there long. People who visited the house often reported strange things. Lights turning on upstairs, footsteps at night, doors opening by themselves. Most buyers lost interest before the sale could ever finish. Corinne told me she had never actually been inside the place herself. After that conversation, I opened the photo again, just to look one more time, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. The figure was still there, standing behind me near the staircase. But this time I noticed one more detail, something I had missed before. The person in the photo wasn't facing the camera the way I thought. Their body was turned slightly toward the stairs, but their head was turned completely toward me, bent at an angle that didn't look natural, almost as if they had been watching me for a very long time. And the strangest part is this. I checked the property listing again a few weeks later. The house on Willow Lane was still for sale, still empty, still waiting, and sometimes late at night. When I remember that photograph, I can't stop thinking about the bedroom upstairs. The warm bed, the open window, and the quiet feeling that someone still lives there. Someone who simply prefers not to be seen. I didn't know my uncle very well. In fact, for most of my life, I only saw him a few times, maybe once every few years at family gatherings. He was always quiet, the kind of person who sat near the edge of the room and listened more than he spoke. My mother used to say he preferred being alone. He lived far outside town, on an old piece of farmland that had been in our family for generations. A small farmhouse stood in the middle of it, surrounded by empty fields and thin rows of trees that bent in the wind. When I was a kid, I remember visiting that place once. Just once. The memory is blurry now, but I still remember how quiet it felt out there. No traffic, no neighbors, just the sound of wind moving through the tall grass. At the time, it made me uncomfortable. Some places have a kind of silence that feels peaceful. That farm had a different kind. The kind that makes you feel watched. Years passed after that visit, and I barely thought about my uncle again. Then one afternoon, everything changed with a single phone call. My mother told me he had passed away. Heart problems, she said. It had happened quietly in his sleep. The strange part was what came next. According to the lawyer handling his affairs, my uncle had left the farmhouse to me. Not to my mother. Not to anyone else in the family. Just me. At first, I thought there must have been some mistake. I had barely spoken to the man in years. There were cousins and older relatives who knew him much better. But the lawyer confirmed it several times. My name was written clearly in the will. The farmhouse and the surrounding land now belonged to me. For a while, I didn't know what to do with that information. Owning a farm wasn't exactly part of my life plan. I worked in an office in the city. My apartment sat above a busy street filled with noise and traffic. The idea of living in a quiet farmhouse miles away from everything felt strange. Still, curiosity eventually got the better of me. A week later, the lawyer mailed me the keys. They arrived in a small envelope with a short note, explaining that the property had been empty since my uncle died. Someone would need to check on the place soon. That someone apparently was now me. So a few days after that, I took time off work and drove out to see the house. The road leading to the farm looked exactly the way I remembered. Long, narrow, surrounded by fields that stretched far into the distance. The farther I drove, the fewer houses I saw. Eventually, the paved road turned into gravel, and the sound of the tires crunching beneath my car filled the quiet air. The sky that day was pale and cloudy. A thin layer of gray covered everything, making the fields look dull and colorless. When I finally saw the farmhouse in the distance, I slowed the car. The building looked older than I remembered. The white paint on the wooden walls had faded into a soft gray. The porch leaned slightly to one side. Tall grass surrounded the front yard, moving gently in the wind. It wasn't falling apart, but it definitely looked tired, like a place that had been standing for a very long time. I parked the car near the front gate and stepped out. The air out there felt different from the city. Cleaner, cooler, but the silence was just as strong as I remembered. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving across the fields. I walked toward the house slowly, the grass brushing against my legs as I went. The porch boards creaked under my weight when I climbed the steps. For a moment I stood there, holding the keys in my hand. It felt strange knowing this place belonged to me now. A house full of memories I didn't share. A life that had belonged to someone I barely knew. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The smell inside hit me immediately. Old wood, dust, and something faintly earthy, like soil after rain. The interior of the farmhouse looked almost exactly how my uncle must have left it. Furniture still stood in the living room. A small couch near the wall, a wooden coffee table, a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. Nothing looked disturbed. It was as if he had simply stepped out one afternoon and never returned. I walked through the house slowly, taking everything in. The kitchen sat toward the back of the first floor, with a narrow window above the sink looking out over the fields. A small dining table stood in the corner, with 2 chairs pushed neatly underneath. Everything looked simple, quiet, lonely, but also strangely peaceful. The second floor held the bedrooms. I climbed the staircase carefully, listening to the familiar creak of old wood beneath my feet. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway stretched across the length of the house. 3 doors lined one side. One of them had been left slightly open. That room turned out to be my uncle's bedroom. The bed was neatly made. A small lamp sat on the nightstand. A pair of reading glasses rested beside a closed book. Seeing those small personal items made the whole situation feel more real. Someone had lived here, day after day, year after year, completely alone. I wondered what that kind of life must have felt like. Quiet mornings, long empty evenings, the same view of the fields every single day. I finished exploring the rest of the house and returned downstairs. Outside, the sky had grown darker. Clouds were gathering again, and the wind had picked up slightly. I looked at my watch. Driving back to the city would take at least 2 hours. But the thought of leaving right away didn't feel right. This place was mine now, and part of me wanted to understand it better. So instead of getting back in the car, I carried my bag inside and placed it on the couch. I decided I would stay there for a few nights, just long enough to clean up a little, look through some of my uncle's things, maybe decide what to do with the property. It seemed like the responsible thing to do. As evening slowly settled over the farm, the house became quieter. The wind outside moved across the fields in slow waves. Old wooden boards shifted gently in the walls. And as I sat alone in the living room of that farmhouse for the first time, I couldn't help but feel something strange. Not fear, not exactly, just the quiet sense that the house was not as empty as it appeared. That somewhere inside those old wooden walls, there were still pieces of my uncle's life quietly waiting to be found. The first night in my uncle's farmhouse was quieter than I expected. At first, the silence felt almost peaceful. I made a simple dinner in the kitchen, using food I had brought from the city. The old refrigerator hummed softly in the corner, and the sound of wind brushed against the windows like a slow whisper. It was the kind of quiet you rarely find anymore. In the city, there is always noise. Cars, people, distant music, something moving all the time. Out there on that farm, the world felt paused. After eating, I walked through the house again with a small flashlight, mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to understand the place better. It felt strange owning a house that still held so many traces of someone else's life. The wooden floors creaked gently as I moved from room to room. My uncle hadn't been a messy person. Everything had its place. Books sat neatly on shelves. Old photographs rested in simple frames on the walls. A coat still hung on the rack near the front door. Looking at those small details made the house feel less abandoned. It felt paused, like time had stopped the moment my uncle was gone. Eventually, I returned to the living room and sat on the couch. Outside, the sky had darkened completely. The fields beyond the windows had turned into long stretches of shadow. I remember thinking that the place might actually grow on me. Maybe I could fix it up, clean it, Visit during quiet weekends away from the city. It didn't feel frightening. Not yet. But sometime later that night, I started noticing something unusual. A sound. At first, it was faint enough that I ignored it. Just a soft creaking noise from somewhere in the house. Old buildings make sounds like that all the time. Wood shifts when the temperature drops. Wind pushes gently against the walls. Still, the noise kept repeating. A slow creak. Then silence. Then another creak. I stood up and listened carefully. The sound didn't seem to come from the upstairs rooms. It didn't come from the kitchen either. It felt lower, almost like it was coming from beneath the floor. That thought made me pause. As far as I knew, the farmhouse didn't have a basement. At least I hadn't seen any sign of one. Curiosity slowly pushed away my tiredness. I grabbed the flashlight and began walking around the first floor again, paying closer attention to the sounds beneath my feet. The floorboards groaned softly with each step. Eventually, I found myself standing in the kitchen. The creaking noise seemed louder there. I turned off the overhead light and stood still. The darkness deepened around me. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the sound came again. A slow wooden shift. It came from somewhere beneath the kitchen floor. I moved the flashlight beam slowly across the room. The cabinets looked normal, the sink, the stove. Then the light passed over a section of wall near the corner. Something about that area looked slightly different. The wood paneling there had a faint outline around it, a rectangular shape that didn't match the rest of the wall. I stepped closer. Running my fingers along the surface, I felt the edges more clearly. It was a door, a narrow one, but it had been sealed shut. 3 thick wooden boards had been nailed across it from the outside. The boards were old and dark with age. Rusted nails held them tightly in place. I crouched down and studied them. Someone had clearly gone out of their way to keep that door closed. And judging by the look of the wood, it had been sealed that way for a very long time. A quiet feeling settled in my stomach. I wasn't afraid exactly, just curious. If there was a basement under the house, it made sense that my uncle would have used it for storage at some point. Still, the boards made it feel strange. Why seal the door instead of simply locking it? I leaned closer and pressed my ear against the wooden panels. For several seconds, I heard nothing. Then, very faintly, I heard a soft shifting sound below, almost like something moving across the floor. My breath slowed. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound didn't repeat. Eventually, the quiet returned again. I pulled back and rubbed my eyes. It was probably just a mouse or some other small animal. Old farmhouses often have small spaces under the floor where animals wander in during cold weather. That explanation made sense. Still, I couldn't stop staring at the door. Something about those boards bothered me. It felt less like someone was keeping animals out, and more like they were trying to keep something in. The thought made me laugh quietly to myself. My imagination was starting to run a little too far. I stood up and looked around the kitchen again. Everything else seemed completely normal. The quiet hum of the refrigerator returned. The wind brushed softly against the windows. And yet, the sealed door remained there in the corner. Silent. Waiting. I thought about removing the boards right then. But it was late, and I didn't have the right tools with me. The nails looked thick and stubborn. It would take some effort to pull them out. So I decided to leave it for the morning. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would come back with a hammer and pry bar. Then I would open the door and see what was down there. Probably just an old cellar. Dusty shelves. Maybe a few forgotten boxes. Nothing unusual. Still, as I turned off the kitchen light and walked back toward the living room, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something beneath the house had moved. And for the rest of that night, while I lay awake in the quiet farmhouse, every small creak in the floorboards made me wonder what might be waiting behind that sealed door. The second night in the farmhouse felt different. Not in a way that was easy to explain. Nothing obvious had changed. The house still looked the same. The fields outside still stretched endlessly in every direction. The same wind moved across the tall grass. But something about the quiet had shifted. It felt heavier, like the house had started paying attention to me. That morning I had walked around the property, trying to get familiar with the land my uncle had left behind. The fields were wide and uneven, with patches of wild plants growing wherever the soil allowed. There was an old wooden barn about 50 yards from the house, though its doors were sealed and half-rotted. The place had clearly been neglected for years, but the farmhouse itself still felt solid. Later in the afternoon, I went back into the kitchen and stood in front of the boarded door again, the one hiding the basement. In the daylight, it looked less unsettling. Just a small door covered by 3 old wooden planks nailed across the frame. I ran my hand over the boards. The wood felt rough and dry. The nails were deep in the wall, rusted from time. For a while, I considered pulling them out right then. I even found an old hammer in one of the drawers nearby. But something about it made me hesitate. It wasn't fear exactly. More like a quiet instinct telling me I didn't need to rush. The basement had been sealed for years. It could wait one more day. So I left it alone. By evening, the sky had turned dark again. The farmhouse felt colder than the night before, and the wind outside had grown stronger. I made a small dinner, then sat at the kitchen table with one of my uncle's old books. Reading helped pass the time in that quiet place. Hours slipped by slowly. Eventually, the house fell into the kind of silence that only exists far away from cities. No traffic, no distant voices, just the faint movement of the wind across the fields. I went upstairs and lay down in the bedroom that used to belong to my uncle. For a long time I stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. The wood creaked softly in the walls. Pipes shifted somewhere beneath the floor. All normal sounds for an old building. At some point, I must have drifted toward sleep. But sometime deep in the night, I woke up again. I didn't know exactly why at first. The room was completely dark. The window beside the bed showed nothing but faint shadows of clouds moving across the sky. For a moment, I simply lay there listening. The wind had grown quiet outside. The house felt still. Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A whisper. Soft, distant, like someone speaking from far away. I held my breath. The whisper came again. I couldn't understand the words. They were too quiet, too blurred by the walls of the house. At first I assumed it must be the wind slipping through a crack somewhere. But the sound continued, and the rhythm of it felt wrong for wind. It sounded like a voice, a human voice, speaking slowly. I sat up in the bed. The whisper seemed to be coming from somewhere inside the walls. That realization made my chest tighten. The farmhouse was old, and older houses often carry sound in strange ways. Voices from outside can travel through vents or crawl spaces. Still, there were no neighbors for miles. No one should have been close enough to whisper through the walls. I swung my legs off the bed and stood quietly in the dark. The whisper continued, soft, patient, repeating something over and over. I stepped into the hallway and listened more carefully. The voice was clearer there, still quiet, still distant, but I could finally make out the word being spoken. It was a name, my uncle's name, over and over again, spoken in a low whisper, almost like someone calling for him. The sound moved slowly through the walls, as if drifting beneath the house. My heart began beating faster. "Hello," I said softly. My voice echoed faintly down the hallway. The whispering stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt thick and uncomfortable. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as I started convincing myself, the sound had only been part of a dream. The whisper returned, but this time it was closer, clearer, and it repeated the same name again. My uncle's name, over and over. Slow, patient, waiting. I followed the sound down the hallway and toward the staircase. Each step of the floor creaked beneath my weight. The whisper continued below me now, drifting through the lower floor of the house, coming from somewhere beneath the kitchen. I stopped halfway down the stairs. My stomach tightened, because there was only one place under the kitchen where a voice could be coming from. The basement. The same basement that had been sealed behind those wooden boards. I stood there in the darkness for a long time, listening. The whisper kept repeating the name. Not louder, not angry, just calm, as if whoever was speaking had been doing it for a very long time. Calling, waiting for an answer. I thought about the boards nailed across the door. The rusted nails, the way someone had clearly wanted that basement closed. Slowly, a quiet thought formed in the back of my mind. What if my uncle hadn't sealed the door to keep something inside? What if he sealed it because something inside kept calling his name? The whisper stopped again. The house returned to silence. But as I stood there in the dark hallway of that farmhouse, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something beneath the floor was still awake, still waiting, still whispering a name that no one in the house could answer anymore. The whispering stopped sometime before morning. At least I think it did. I remember standing at the bottom of the staircase for a long time that night, listening into the darkness. The house felt completely still again, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But the sound of that voice, repeating my uncle's name, stayed with me. Even after I went back upstairs. Even after the sky slowly began to light outside the bedroom window. When morning finally came, the farmhouse looked calm and ordinary again. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor. The fields outside moved gently in the breeze. It almost felt foolish to think about the whispering from the night before. Almost. But when I walked into the kitchen and saw the boarded basement door again, that uneasy feeling returned. The 3 wooden planks were still nailed firmly across it. Silent, waiting. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. Part of me wanted to ignore the whole thing, close the door to the kitchen, and leave the basement sealed the way my uncle had left it. But curiosity can be a stubborn thing. And there was another thought I couldn't shake. If someone was actually down there, if someone had been living beneath the house, then I needed to know. So I went out to the barn and searched around until I found an old crowbar leaning against one of the walls. It was rusty, but still strong. Back in the kitchen, I knelt in front of the sealed door. The boards looked even older in the daylight. Dark, dry, each nail sunk deep into the wood. It took some effort to pull the first board loose. The crowbar groaned against the nail as I pried upward. After a few seconds, the metal finally slipped free with a sharp creak. The second board came off a little easier. The third took the longest. When it finally dropped to the floor, the small wooden door behind them was fully visible. It had no lock, just a round metal handle that looked worn with age. I sat there quietly for a moment, listening. The kitchen was silent. No whispering, no movement, just the distant sound of wind moving across the fields outside. Slowly, I reached forward and pulled the handle. The door opened with a long, tired groan. Cold air drifted upward from the darkness below. A narrow set of wooden steps disappeared into the basement. The smell that rose from below was strong. Earth, dust, and something else I couldn't quite place. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and switched it on. The beam of light cut into the darkness, revealing the first few steps of the staircase. Old wood, worn from years of use. For a moment, I wondered how long it had been since anyone had walked down there. Then I remembered the whisper from the night before, and the strange creaking sound beneath the floor. I took a slow breath and started down the steps. Each step groaned under my weight. The basement was deeper than I expected. The ceiling above the staircase felt low, forcing me to duck slightly as I descended. The air grew colder the farther down I went. When my feet finally reached the dirt floor, I raised the flashlight and looked around. The basement was larger than the kitchen above it. Rough stone walls surrounded the space. Wooden support beams stretched across the ceiling. The floor was packed dirt with scattered patches of old concrete. At first glance, the room looked like a normal cellar. Shelves lined one wall, filled with dusty jars and empty boxes. An old workbench sat in the corner. Nothing unusual. But as I moved deeper into the room, the light from the flashlight began revealing things that didn't belong in a forgotten basement. A thin mattress lay on the floor near the far wall. Not an old one. It looked fairly new. A small blanket rested on top of it. Next to the mattress sat a metal bucket and a plastic water container. I stopped walking. My heart began to beat a little faster. Someone had been living down here. Not years ago. Recently. The mattress didn't look dusty. The blanket was folded neatly. I moved the flashlight slowly across the rest of the basement. More objects came into view. A small camping lantern, a stack of canned food, several empty water bottles. The quiet realization settled over me. Whoever had been using this place had stayed here for a long time. Long enough to bring supplies. Long enough to build a small life beneath the house. And judging by the look of things, they hadn't left very long ago. I stepped closer to the mattress. The air down there felt heavy. Still, almost stale. The flashlight beam drifted across the dirt floor. That was when I noticed something else. Words scratched into the ground. Dozens of them, all written in the same uneven pattern. My uncle's name, over and over again. The letters dug into the dirt with something sharp. The name repeated across the floor like someone had been writing it for hours. Or days. Maybe longer. A cold feeling spread slowly through my chest. The whisper from the night before echoed in my mind. The voice repeating the same name again and again. I slowly turned the flashlight toward the far corner of the basement. That was when I saw something else. A small opening in the stone wall. Just big enough for someone to crawl through. Darkness filled the tunnel beyond it. The edges of the opening were worn smooth, as if someone had been using it frequently. The sight made my skin crawl. Because the basement had been sealed, the boards across the door had been there for years, which meant something very simple. Whoever had been living down here hadn't been entering through the house. They had been coming and going through that tunnel. I stood there in the quiet basement for a long moment, listening. The air felt thick, heavy, then very faintly. A sound drifted through the darkness of the tunnel. A slow movement. like someone shifting deeper inside. And in that long, quiet moment beneath the farmhouse, I began to understand something unsettling. My uncle may have sealed the basement door years ago, but whoever had been living under the house had never really left. Night security work is mostly quiet. People imagine it as something tense like the movies, dark buildings, flashlights cutting through shadows, someone creeping around every corner. But the truth is usually much slower than that. Most nights are long stretches of silence. You walk empty streets. You check doors that are always locked. You sit in your car watching buildings that never move. After a while, you start noticing small things. The sound of wind moving through trees, the hum of streetlights, the way a quiet place seems to breathe when no one is around. I had been doing night security for almost 5 years when I got the job at Blackwood Street. It wasn't a huge contract, just a private neighborhood on the edge of town, a quiet area with wide streets and large houses sitting behind tall fences. The residents had recently hired a security company after a series of strange motion alarms kept going off. Not in every house, just one. The property sat near the end of Blackwood Street, at the corner where the road curved toward a wooded area. According to the report, the house had been empty for almost 3 years. No owner living there, no tenants, but the motion sensors installed inside the property kept triggering late at night. Sometimes once, sometimes several times in a single evening. At first, people assumed it was animals, maybe raccoons or stray cats finding their way inside. But the strange part was the pattern. The alarms always went off upstairs, never in the living room, never near the doors, always the second floor. Eventually, the homeowners association hired a security company to keep an eye on the area during the night. That's where I came in. My shift started at 10 in the evening. By the time I arrived on Blackwood Street, most of the neighborhood lights were already off. The place looked peaceful. Tall trees lined both sides of the road. The houses were spaced far apart, each sitting on wide pieces of land with trimmed lawns and quiet gardens. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing seemed out of place, at least not at first. I parked my security vehicle near the entrance and checked the schedule on my phone. My job was simple: drive through the street once every hour, check the empty property whenever the motion alarm triggered, write a short report at the end of the shift. Easy work. The first few hours passed quietly. I drove slowly through the neighborhood, headlights moving across empty driveways and silent houses. Every porch light glowed softly in the dark. Every window remained still. Around midnight, I parked near the corner of the street and stepped out of the car for a quick walk. The air was cool that night. A light breeze moved through the trees, making the branches whisper above the road. At the far end of the street stood the house. Even from a distance, it looked different from the others. The yard had grown uneven and wild. Tall grass leaned against the broken fence along the sidewalk. Most of the windows were dark. Only the faint reflection of the streetlights shimmered across the glass. The house itself wasn't falling apart, but it had that look abandoned places sometimes get. Quiet, still, almost like it had been holding its breath for years. I walked closer to the gate and looked at the front of the property. The alarm system was installed inside the house, connected to a motion sensor network in the upper rooms. Whenever something moved inside, the system would send a signal to the security office. Then someone like me would come check. I stood there for a few minutes, shining my flashlight across the yard. Nothing moved. The windows stayed dark. Eventually, I returned to my car and continued the patrol. Around 1 in the morning, the alarm finally triggered. My phone buzzed with a notification from the system. Blackwood Street property, motion detected, second floor. I stared at the message for a moment. Then I started the car and drove back toward the house. The neighborhood remained completely quiet. No cars passed. No lights turned on. When I reached the property, everything looked exactly the same as before. The front yard was empty. The windows were dark. Still, the system insisted something had moved upstairs. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the front gate. The metal hinges creaked softly as I pushed it open. Tall grass brushed against my legs as I crossed the yard. Up close, the house looked older than the others on the street. The paint had faded, and the wooden porch sagged slightly near the steps. I climbed the porch slowly. The front door was locked, just like the report said it would be. No sign of forced entry. No broken glass. I circled the house once with my flashlight. Every window looked sealed. The back door was locked as well. There were no footprints in the dirt around the yard. No signs that anyone had been there. After about 10 minutes, I returned to the car and wrote a short note in the report. Possible false alarm. Probably a loose sensor. It happens sometimes. The system resets itself, and the night moves on. I started the car and drove back toward the end of the street. The clock on the dashboard read 1:22 a.m. For a while, everything stayed quiet again. The wind moved softly through the trees. The houses remained dark. Then, about 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another alert. Blackwood Street property, motion detected, second floor. I frowned and looked back down the street. The abandoned house stood exactly where I had left it. Silent, dark, empty, or at least it was supposed to be. I turned the car around and started driving back. This time something felt different. The night seemed quieter than before. The air heavier. When I pulled up to the property again, my headlights swept across the front windows. For just a second, I thought I saw something move upstairs. A shadow crossing one of the second floor windows. It was quick. So quick I almost convinced myself it had been a reflection from the trees. Still, the alarm had triggered twice now, and both times the movement came from upstairs. I stepped out of the car again and looked up at the dark windows. The glass reflected nothing but the empty street behind me. The second floor remained completely still. But as I stood there in the quiet yard of that abandoned house, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something inside the building had just moved away from the window. Like it knew I was watching. I waited for the next night with a mixture of curiosity and a quiet sense of dread. The first night had been strange enough. I had patrolled the street, responded to the motion alarms, and yet nothing had been visible. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the abandoned house on Blackwood Street wasn't entirely empty. I arrived at my post around 10 in the evening as usual. The neighborhood was calm. The streetlights cast long, thin shadows across the pavement, stretching in every direction. My car sat parked near the entrance to the street, engine off, as I watched the houses lining the road. Most of them were dark, save for a few porch lights flickering softly in the wind. As I sat there, I tried to focus on the routine of my work. Drive slowly, check the alarms, log the time, repeat. It sounds simple, almost boring, but in this kind of job, boredom is often preferable to excitement. The house at the corner remained the same. Overgrown yard, broken fence, dark windows, still silent, still waiting. I patrolled the area twice before midnight without incident. The wind moved through the trees in soft whispers, and every so often, a loose branch scraped against the pavement. Nothing more. Then, just before 2:00 a.m., I parked the car near the abandoned house again. I had an odd feeling in my chest, the kind of small, quiet unease that creeps in when you realize the night has grown heavier than usual. I stepped out and crossed the yard slowly. The grass brushed against my legs. The wind shifted around me, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and something older, almost musty, from the house itself. I reached the front gate and paused. My eyes drifted upward to the second floor. That's when I saw it, a faint glow from one of the windows. It was small, barely more than a pinprick of light. But it was there. I froze. The light didn't flicker like a reflection from the street lamp. It didn't dance like moonlight might off a pane of glass. It sat there quietly, almost patiently, as if waiting for me to notice. I checked my watch, 2:13 a.m. exactly. I felt my heart slow to a deliberate, careful rhythm. For several minutes I just stood there, watching. The rest of the house remained dark. The faint glow came from one of the upstairs windows, the one on the left side of the building. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor's flashlight reflected in the glass. Maybe a passing car's headlight caught the window at just the right angle, but nothing outside the property moved. No cars, no people, just the wind through the trees. The more I stared, the more the light seemed to thicken, as if it were aware I was looking. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the room, but it had a presence, a quiet insistence. I walked around the yard slowly, shining my flashlight along the walls. Nothing. The house remained locked and silent. And then I realized something. The alarms had never detected anything at that precise moment. The sensors were in the second floor rooms. They would have gone off if anyone had walked near the windows, but the light appeared without triggering anything. It was just there. I leaned against the fence, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe I was imagining it. Sleep deprivation can do that. It can twist shadows, turn distant lights into shapes that seem almost human. Yet my gut told me otherwise. Night after night, I returned to the same post, always around 2:00 a.m., always waiting for that exact moment. 2:13 a.m. Every night without fail, a faint light appeared in that same window. Some nights it lingered for only a few seconds. Other nights it remained for a full minute, as if the house itself were breathing slowly, quietly in that faint glow. I began timing it with my phone. I kept a log. 2:13 a.m. Not 2:12, not 2:14, always 2:13. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed. Human minds do that. They crave repetition. They see meaning in randomness. Still, I couldn't stop watching. Then I noticed something else. The light, it seemed to respond. Not to me exactly, but to my presence. If I stepped back, it faded slightly. If I leaned forward to look closer, it seemed to strengthen, as if pulling attention toward itself. I never saw movement inside the room. No shadow, no figure, just the faint glow. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind dropped completely, I thought I heard a faint creak from inside the house. Not loud, not a scream, not a crash, just a soft creaking like wood settling or someone walking slowly across an empty floor. I began to notice the small details, the way the light never touched the curtains, the way it seemed to hover near the center of the window pane, the way it appeared in exactly the same spot, night after night. I tried talking to other security guards about it. Most laughed it off. Old house, weird light, nothing to worry about, they said. But I couldn't shake it. One night, I stood closer than ever, leaning against the porch railing, flashlight in hand. The light appeared at 2:13 a.m., faint but persistent. I watched it carefully. Then it moved. Not across the window, but within it. A subtle shift, like the glow was stretching, bending, reaching. It was slow, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I blinked. The light settled again, exactly where it had been. I didn't move for the rest of my shift. By 3:00 a.m., the glow had vanished. The house returned to darkness. The wind whispered softly. The streetlights hummed. I drove back to my post farther down the street, heart still racing. I told myself it was just a trick of the night. But I knew. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't gone. And it would be back tomorrow. At exactly 2:13 a.m. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because of exhaustion, but because my mind kept returning to the faint glow in that upstairs window at exactly 2:13 a.m. I replayed the nights in my head, wondering what it could be. Was it a trick of the eye, a reflection, something mechanical left behind by the previous owner? I told myself I would find out for sure. The next day, I returned to the security office earlier than usual. I needed to review the footage from the previous nights, all of it. I sat at the monitor, rewound each clip carefully, and watched. Nothing happened for the first few hours. Cars passing in the distance, streetlights flickering, routine neighborhood life. Then, as the clock approached 2:13 a.m. in the first clip, I paused. There it was. A faint light flickering in the second-floor window, almost exactly as I had seen it in person. I zoomed in, and then my stomach went cold. For just a fraction of a second, a shape appeared in the window, a figure standing, watching. I blinked, rewound, and played the footage again. Same result, same figure. It wasn't detailed enough to make out a face. The shadow was vague, as if blurred by distance or low light, but it had the outline of a person, tall, still, unblinking, watching me, or maybe just watching the street. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, maybe a trick of the camera, a shadow from a passing branch. But then I checked the footage from the next night. 2:13 a.m. The light appeared, the figure stood in the same spot, watching. And the night after that, same time, same light, same figure. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. My mind struggled to accept what I was seeing. A house that had been abandoned for years. Motion alarms triggered sometimes. And yet, night after night, a person appeared in the same window. No one else reported seeing them. No neighbor had mentioned anyone inside. The house was sealed, locks intact, windows shut tight. I checked the recordings again and again. Each time I saw the same shape, always at 2:13 a.m., always silent, never moving from the window. I began to feel watched, even when I wasn't at the house, even during the day. I would drive past the property, glance at the windows, and the memory of that figure made my stomach tighten. I started arriving earlier, staying later, trying to catch something, trying to understand. But the figure never moved, never appeared before 2:13, never after, just there, patient, waiting. One night I decided to approach closer, to see if I could get a better view. I parked near the curb, careful not to disturb the quiet of the street. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, my footsteps soft against the pavement. The yard was overgrown, the fence sagging in places. I approached slowly. At exactly 2:13 a.m., the light appeared. The figure stood there, motionless. I shined my flashlight toward the window. The beam cut across the glass. For a moment I expected to see a reaction, but the figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there watching. My chest tightened, the hairs on my arms prickled. Something about it felt deliberate, aware. I didn't dare move closer. I didn't need to. Just standing there, looking up at that window, I felt a presence that seemed almost alive. When I returned to the car and reviewed the footage the next morning, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The figure wasn't always exactly the same. Sometimes it seemed slightly taller, slightly closer to the window. Sometimes the shape shifted subtly, like it was aware of the camera itself. I felt a quiet panic, not a sharp, sudden fear, but a slow, sinking dread that began to grow in my chest and spread outward. If the house was abandoned, if no one was supposed to be there, who was it? And why did it appear only at 2:13 a.m.? I began to notice the small things. the slight creaking of the floorboards inside the house just before the light appeared, the faintest smell of wood smoke or damp earth drifting through the camera's audio, tiny details I had ignored at first. Each night I watched the figure, always the same, always silent, always waiting. It wasn't trying to scare me, not directly, not yet. It was just there, watching, patient, unblinking. I started to dread that exact minute every night. 2:12 a.m. would feel like the calm before a storm, and at 2:13, the light would appear and the figure would stand. I began to think about why someone or something would stay in that house, night after night, year after year. If it had been human, how had they avoided discovery? How had no one noticed movement, sound, or entry? And slowly, quietly, I realized something even worse. The figure wasn't moving, but it was alive in a different way. It didn't need doors or windows. It didn't need to leave the house. Because it wasn't just standing in the window. It was waiting for me to see it. And every night when I watched, I felt it learning, watching me as I watched it. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Even knowing that it was impossible, unreal, maybe even dangerous, I kept watching. Night after night. At exactly 2:13 a.m., I arrived at the small rural town just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the empty fields. My car rattled along the narrow country road, tires crunching over gravel, the only sound besides the wind threading through the trees. I had been traveling for hours, tired, eager for a place to rest, and I had found something almost impossibly cheap on Airbnb. The listing was sparse, no reviews, no photos beyond a single, slightly blurry shot of a weathered farmhouse perched on a slight hill. The description was short: quiet getaway, affordable basic amenities. The lack of reviews should have made me pause, should have made me wonder, but my budget was small and the exhaustion was real. The house came into view just as the last golden rays of the sun disappeared behind the horizon. It was older than I had imagined. Weathered gray wood clung to a frame that sagged slightly, giving the impression of slow, relentless decay. Windows reflected the last light, a faint glow that almost seemed to hum, but I told myself it was just the reflection of the sky. I pulled the car up to a narrow dirt driveway, kicked gravel with my tires, and sat for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. The world here felt different, quieter. The hum of distant insects, the rustle of leaves, it all seemed sharper than usual. The house waited at the end of the driveway like a silent sentinel. I grabbed my bags and walked toward the front door. The steps creaked beneath my weight, each sound amplified by the quiet around me. I fumbled with the key left under the doormat, a note from the host attached with simple instructions. Welcome. Make yourself at home. The lights are on inside. The door opened with a groan that carried through the empty rooms. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a kind of musty warmth that made me realize it hadn't been lived in recently, yet someone had kept it from falling apart entirely. I set my bags down in what seemed to be the living room. The furniture was sparse: a worn couch, a small wooden table. A single lamp on a side table flickered to life when I switched it on, casting soft shadows across the room. I walked slowly from room to room, checking the basic amenities as the listing had promised. Everything was functional if minimal: a small kitchen, a bedroom with clean sheets, a bathroom with water that ran clear and hot. I should have felt relief, the kind of satisfaction that comes from finding exactly what you were promised. But I didn't. There was something strange about the quiet. Not just the absence of people, but the way it pressed against you, a presence that seemed to hover just beyond perception. The walls themselves seemed to lean in slightly, the floors settling under an invisible weight. Every sound echoed just a little too long. I told myself it was imagination. Rural houses do that. Old wood does that. The mind notices patterns in silence. Still, as night fell, I found myself drawn to the living room window. The glass reflected the darkness outside, but in the faint light of the lamp, I could make out shapes moving in the shadows of the yard, or perhaps beyond the yard, in the fields stretching toward the horizon. I shook my head and went to unpack. The first night passed with the usual quietness of rural areas. Crickets, wind, occasionally a distant dog barking far enough away to be indistinct. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's travel. But in the middle of the night, I woke with a start. There was a sound, a faint creaking from the floor above. I had thought the house was only one story. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was the house settling, the old beams expanding or contracting in the cold night air. I tried to go back to sleep, but the sensation of being watched lingered. Morning brought no answers. Sunlight filled the rooms, washing away shadows. I told myself I had imagined the creaking. I left the house briefly to explore the small town nearby, a place with a single gas station, a diner, and a few scattered houses. No one mentioned the farmhouse. No one asked why I had come so far. It was as if the place existed outside their attention. I returned that evening, hopping to shake the unease that had settled over me. I made dinner in the small kitchen, then sat in the living room with a cup of tea. I tried to occupy my mind with thoughts of tomorrow's journey, of roads yet to travel. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint mark in the corner of the ceiling, a scratch, or maybe several, not random but deliberate, patterned almost, forming thin, shallow lines that seemed to trace the edges of the ceiling near the wall. I stepped closer, running my finger over the lines. They were old, slightly darkened, as if time had stained them. I crouched to examine them, but the deeper I looked, the more I noticed subtle details I hadn't before. Small dents in the wooden floor, marks on the door frames, and a faint trace of dust disturbed in a path leading toward the back of the house. I realized then the house had been lived in, not recently perhaps, but by someone. Someone who had left, or perhaps someone who had never fully left. A shiver ran down my spine. I had booked the cheapest listing I could find. No reviews, no verification beyond the photos on the website. It should have been simple, safe, just a roof for the night. But now, standing in the dim light of that old farmhouse, I understood that simplicity was an illusion. The house waited quietly, watching me as I watched it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been here before was still nearby, lingering in the corners, in the wood, in the shadows that seemed just slightly too dark for their own good. I went to bed early, trying to ignore the unease pressing against my chest, but sleep was slow to come. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every movement beyond the window pulled me from rest. I told myself it was just the house, settling again. Old buildings do that. Old buildings do that. And yet, when I finally drifted toward sleep, I had the unmistakable impression of someone or something standing just outside the frame of my vision, waiting, patient, silent. The cheap listing had been everything I asked for in price, but I knew, even then, as the night drew on, that cheapness often comes with a cost no one mentions. And in the quiet, dark corners of that farmhouse, I was beginning to understand what that cost might be. I pulled the front door closed behind me, the soft click echoing through the old house. The air smelled faintly of aged wood and dust, the kind that seeps into your clothes and lingers long after you leave. I set my bag down in the corner, then slowly walked toward the living room table. Something had caught my eye the night before, a small leather-bound book tucked under a stack of newspapers. It was nothing fancy, the kind of thing someone might leave to make a place feel lived in or cared for. But when I opened it, I realized it wasn't ordinary at all. The first page was neatly written, almost formal. "Welcome to our home. Please leave your name and thoughts." I smiled faintly, typical guestbook etiquette. I flipped the page, expecting the usual polite notes. "Had a wonderful stay," or "Thank you for your hospitality." But the entries weren't like that. Names were written, yes. Dates, sometimes just a month and year. But there were no departure notes, no signatures saying goodbye, just entries that seemed to stretch endlessly, people arriving but never leaving. I read the first few aloud softly, more to myself than anyone else. April 2017, enjoyed the quiet, felt safe. July 2018, the view was perfect. I may stay longer. November 2019, this place feels like home. I am not leaving. The words made my stomach tight. Each note carried a calmness, almost a contentment, that contrasted sharply with the house's growing unease. People writing as if they had no intention of ever leaving. I turned the page slowly, careful not to rush. More entries, sometimes short, sometimes long. Observations about the weather, the house, the fields outside. Comments about how the nights were particularly quiet, how the stars shone more brightly here than anywhere else. The last entry on that page was dated nearly a decade ago. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, but still deliberate. I have been here for 3 weeks. I see no one else. I do not mind. Perhaps I am meant to stay. I set the book down on the table, breathing a little faster than I wanted to. The house felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. I told myself it was just a collection of old notes. Maybe someone had a fascination with this property. Maybe people had stayed for long stretches, and the book simply reflected that. But then I turned the next page. More names, more dates. Some entries were impossible, dates from years before Airbnb even existed, and some names repeated. I saw E. Collins listed in 2008, then again in 2012, then again in 2017. Each time the writing was the same, almost identical. I paused. I traced the letters with my finger. The ink seemed to sink into the leather, permanent and unchanging. I read on, my voice lowering unconsciously. December 2014, I have seen the light upstairs. I do not mind, it watches, but it is kind. A chill ran down my spine. The light, the same one I had glimpsed in the upstairs window the night I arrived. The description was subtle, almost casual, but the implication was clear. Someone or something was aware. Someone or something was waiting. I flipped further. Some entries were barely legible, words smudged, sentences broken mid-thought. But the tone remained eerily calm. People who had stayed and seemed not to mind that they had not left. Some even wrote about feeling a strange companionship with the house itself. The idea struck me like a weight in my chest. Were these people truly guests, or had they become part of the house in some way? I closed the book slowly, careful not to let the sound echo too loudly. I pressed my palms against the table, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath my fingers. The house seemed to respond to my tension, every creak of the floorboard sharper, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls louder. I placed the guest book back on the shelf, but the words lingered in my mind. Names, dates, observations, and that subtle calmness that made the unthinkable seem possible. People had stayed. People had written. People had never left. I began to notice things I hadn't before. Faint impressions on the floors where someone had walked. A subtle warmth near the corners of rooms, as if the house itself remembered footsteps that were no longer there. Small disturbances in dust along the windowsills, lines that suggested a hand had rested there recently. I told myself I was overthinking. Exhaustion, the stress of travel, rural isolation. Yet the unease persisted. I kept the guest book close to my mind, thinking about the pattern. Every entry, no matter the year, seemed calm, even contented. No panic, no complaint, just acceptance. And sometimes subtle references to the upstairs room, the faint light, the quiet presence that no one else seemed to notice. I walked through the living room slowly, glancing up at the ceiling. No lights, no movement, just shadows stretching across the walls in the lamplight. But the thought persisted. Those who had written, those who had stayed, never left. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they had moved away and forgotten to sign out. Maybe the book had been left behind by the original owners. Maybe the entries were fabrications. But then my eyes fell on a final, small note tucked between the pages. No date, no name, just a single line. I will see you soon. I froze, my hand hovering over the page. The words were small, careful, deliberate, not a mistake, not casual, a promise or perhaps a warning. The house settled around me. The wind outside whispered through the trees. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned ever so slightly. And I realized, with a quiet, sinking dread, that I was no longer simply a visitor. I was part of the story now. The guest book had called me, and whether I wanted to leave or not, it was only a matter of time before the house expected me to stay. I remember the morning I decided to leave the house behind for a while and try to understand more about its history. The air was crisp, early sunlight spilling across the dusty fields surrounding the farmhouse. I drove slowly down the winding road into town, trying to calm the uneasy weight that had settled in my chest over the past few nights. The guest book and the strange light upstairs were still fresh in my mind, and I knew I needed answers. I stopped at a small cafe near the town center, one of those places with faded signs and chipped paint, the kind that seemed to have existed unchanged for decades. I asked the barista about the house, careful, polite, casual. She hesitated at first, and I could feel her looking around the cafe as if the walls themselves were listening. "You mean the farmhouse on Blackwood Road?" she said finally, voice low. "No one's lived there in years." I nodded, prompting her to continue. "The owner, he just vanished," she said quietly, glancing at the other patrons who were pretending not to listen. "Nobody knows where he went, just gone. The place sat empty for a long time. People would come and look at it, sure, but no one ever stayed, not really." Her words made my stomach tight. I had thought I was imagining things, that the light, the sounds, the guest book entries, they were tricks of my mind. But she was confirming something else entirely. Someone had disappeared. I asked for details, though I knew they might be vague. She told me the man had been reclusive, moved there years ago after inheriting the property from a relative. Neighbors rarely saw him. Sometimes the wind would carry the sound of someone moving inside, a door slamming, footsteps on the porch, but when they looked, no one was there. "And yet," she said, "I keep seeing that place on the internet. Every year it pops up on Airbnb, like someone is still renting it, like it never stopped existing." Her words made my skin crawl. The listing I had found, the cheap getaway I had booked, was just the latest in a series that had persisted over years. But if the owner vanished, if the house had truly been abandoned, how could it keep appearing online? I drove back slowly, thinking about her words, the rising tension in my chest. The house itself seemed to shift in my memory, darker now in the daytime, its angles sharper, the shadows between the boards deeper. Back at the farmhouse, I approached the front door carefully. I had spent days exploring, cataloging the faint marks on the floors, the whispered groans of the old wood, the faint odor of something long settled and earthy. But now, knowing the house had a vanished owner, everything seemed heavier, as if the walls carried secrets I could never fully understand. Inside, I checked the guest book again. The entries were the same, names and dates stretching back over a decade. But now, with the knowledge of the owner's disappearance, they felt less like casual notes and more like records of something else entirely, people drifting into a place where no one could leave. I lingered in the living room, tracing my fingers along the table where the book rested. I could almost feel a presence in the air, something patient and still, something waiting. That night I watched the upstairs window as I had before. 2:13 a.m. approached slowly, each second stretching longer than the last. The faint light appeared just as it always did, casting its soft, almost gentle glow across the darkened yard. But this time I wasn't just a visitor. I was aware of the history of the vanished man, of the pattern that had persisted for years. I couldn't stop thinking about what the guest book had hinted at, the entries from people who had never left. Had the vanished owner become one of them? Or was he something else entirely, part of the house, part of the quiet presence that seemed to linger behind every shadow? The light in the window remained for nearly a full minute, unwavering, patient. I tried to move closer to get a better view, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. I could sense more than see that someone or something was there, waiting, watching. I went to bed that night with the book closed beside me, but sleep was impossible. My mind replayed the stories of those who had stayed, the notes about the calm light, the whispered observations in the dark. Each memory pressed against me, reminding me that the house didn't need the internet to exist. It didn't need the owner to continue. It simply persisted. And I began to understand in a slow, sinking way that my own presence, my own decision to book this cheap listing, had become part of its history. The house did not need to welcome guests. It only needed to be observed, to have its patterns acknowledged, to exist quietly while people, one by one, became part of it. In the darkness, I felt its patience, the quiet certainty that I had arrived at exactly the right time, and that some part of the house was waiting for me to recognize the impossible truth, that it was alive in its own way, and it had always been waiting for someone to notice. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows in the lamp's glow, and I knew, without knowing how I knew, that the house would never let me leave completely. I remember it clearly, though it feels like a memory stitched together from quiet afternoons and long summer evenings. The house across the street was always there, even when I wasn't looking directly at it. It had a kind of stubborn permanence, as if it existed for its own sake, independent of the world around it. I was a child then, and the world was full of ordinary worries, homework, chores, the hum of the television. But that house had a presence that demanded attention. It sat behind a low, iron fence, paint peeling along the shutters, the lawn more wild than tended. I would glance out my bedroom window, half curious, half afraid, and notice the curtains in the living room moving, flickering, though I never saw anyone inside. Just shadows brushing against fabric, as if someone, or something, was walking silently behind them. I remember asking my mother about it once. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "do people live there?" She glanced out the window, her eyes narrowing for a moment. "Not that I know of," she replied, her tone casual but slightly tense. "Probably just the wind moving the curtains." I nodded, though I didn't believe her. The house had always seemed more deliberate than that. The movement wasn't random. It was slow, careful, observant, like the house itself was breathing, shifting just enough to suggest someone or something was inside. On some afternoons, when the sun hung low and cast long shadows across the street, I would stand at the curb with my friends, pretending to be playing, but my attention always drifted to that house. I would see the curtain sway ever so slightly, then freeze. And then, as if the house had noticed me noticing, they would move again. I can't explain the feeling that settled in my chest those times, a mix of curiosity and unease, like I was peering into a place that existed outside the rules of my ordinary childhood. Sometimes I would run home quickly, cheeks burning, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the memory of the house never left me. I recall one particular evening, late in summer, when the air was warm and sticky, and the cicadas sang from the trees along the street. I had finished my chores and was leaning against the railing of our porch, watching the fading light stretch across the neighborhood. The house across the street was dark, except for a faint glow that flickered behind the curtains. The curtains moved again, not gently this time, but in a deliberate rhythm, as if someone was packing back and forth. I wanted to look away, to tell myself it was nothing, but my eyes stayed fixed, glued to the subtle, impossible motion. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the curtain stilled. The glow vanished, and I was left with the quiet street and the heavy stillness of the house, like it had never moved at all. Sometimes I would imagine what it would be like to step inside. to see who or what lived there, but I never dared. The house had a boundary that extended beyond its walls. To cross the street and reach it felt like stepping into another world, one that wasn't meant for children or perhaps anyone at all. I began to notice other small things over time. The way the shadows in the windows seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. The faint sound of scraping or shuffling, almost like the house itself was moving quietly at night. And sometimes, when I pressed my ear to the window, I thought I could hear whispering, soft and distant, words I could almost make out but never fully understood. My friends never noticed it the way I did. They laughed when I tried to tell them, calling it shadows or imagination. I nodded, smiling, but the unease didn't fade. The house watched in a way I couldn't explain, and I felt watched in return. There were nights when I would wake suddenly, hearing noises that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. A soft creak, a subtle shift in the shadows, and my eyes would dart instinctively toward that street. The house stood in darkness, curtains still, but I knew what had moved during the quiet hours. As I grew older, I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that childhood imagination had exaggerated everything. But the memory of that house persisted. Every time I returned to that street, even years later, the same sensation returned. The feeling that the house was alive, patient, waiting, as if it had been expecting me all along. Even now, when I recount it, I can feel the same weight pressing against my chest, the same slow awareness that some places exist quietly, deliberately, beyond ordinary understanding. And I know that house, across the street, is one of them. It wasn't just a house, not really. It was a presence, a patient observer, and I had been a child who had noticed. I remember the first time I noticed it, though it was years after I had left that street behind. I had grown older, moved away, and the memory of the house had dimmed like an old photograph left in sunlight too long. Yet, on a quiet evening, long after the world had slowed and shadows stretched across the neighborhoods, I saw it again. From my car window, I noticed a faint glow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the streetlight reflecting off a window or a neighbor's porch lamp. But as I slowed, my pulse quickened. It was coming from the abandoned house across the street, the same one I had watched as a child, the one whose curtains had moved on their own. Only now the glow wasn't flickering or hesitant. It was steady, deliberate. I parked on the curb, hands trembling slightly, and watched. Every instinct in my body told me to drive away, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something drew me closer. The memories of my childhood, the curiosity that had made me stare from my porch, the subtle unease that had followed me for years, all of it pressed forward, urging me to stay. The house hadn't changed much outwardly. Its paint had weathered further, shingles curling along the roof, the iron fence rusted and uneven. Yet inside, the windows glowed warmly, spilling a soft light into the evening air. The curtains moved ever so slightly, but this time it wasn't random. It was measured, like someone walking slowly behind them, pausing, then moving again. I stepped closer, each footfall careful, conscious of the gravel crunching beneath my shoes. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, though there was no fire. My throat tightened. The house seemed alive in a way I hadn't realized as a child. It wasn't just the presence of someone or something inside. It was the house itself, breathing quietly, deliberately, waiting. I remembered the small entries in the guest book I had once glimpsed during my travels. People who had stayed and never left. Now, the light in the windows made sense, though it also made no sense at all. Was someone living there? Or was it the house itself, somehow manifesting a presence that should have been impossible? I watched as a shadow moved across the second-floor window, deliberate, slow. It paused at the edge of the glass and seemed to regard me. My skin prickled, and a low, cold tension settled over my chest. I told myself it was impossible. The house had been abandoned for decades. The owner had vanished. There should be no one there. And yet, the evidence was right in front of me. I returned home that night but couldn't shake the image. The glow through the curtains, the shadow pausing at the window, the deep, steady sense that the house had been waiting, not for me exactly, but for someone to notice. Over the following days, I found myself drawn back, unable to resist. Each night, around the same hour, the lights came on. Not every window, just the ones that had always drawn my gaze as a child. And every night, I felt the same tension, the same quiet observation, as if the house was aware of me noticing, aware that I had returned after all these years. I began to keep a journal, recording the times the lights appeared, the subtle movements behind the curtains, the shadows that seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. Every detail felt like a fragment of a larger story, one I couldn't yet understand. Neighbors noticed too, eventually. Some mentioned they had driven past and seen the house lit, though none had dared approach. It became a quiet topic in the town, whispered at the grocery store or on the bus. Everyone had noticed the house across the street suddenly lighting up after decades of darkness, but no one could explain it. One evening, I stood on the curb again, the street empty except for me. The lights flickered on at precisely 9:07, spilling through the curtains with a warm, almost inviting glow. I saw the shadow move deliberately across the upper windows, pause, then retreat. I held my breath, feeling the weight of those years pressing on me. The memory of the house from childhood, the creeping sense of being watched, the long, slow thread connecting my past to this moment. I knew then that the house had never really been abandoned. Its absence had been an illusion, a quiet patience that stretched through decades. And now, having returned, I was acutely aware of its deliberate presence. Every night it reminded me that some places are not empty. Some places never truly let go. I left reluctantly, my steps heavy with unease. But the glow lingered in my mind long after I turned the corner. The house had waited, and after all those years, it had finally been noticed again. I noticed him the first time without really realizing I had noticed him. It was subtle at first, a pale shape behind the curtains, a faint outline against the dim glow of the upstairs light. I had been standing across the street, just watching the house, trying to convince myself that the light was the only thing moving, that nothing could possibly be there. But then I saw the shape shift, almost imperceptibly, and I knew it wasn't just the curtains or a trick of the shadows. Someone, or something, was standing at the window, tall, still, almost impossibly pale, and yet it seemed to fill the entire frame. I froze. My legs felt rooted to the spot. I told myself it had to be a reflection, or maybe a neighbor with the lights on upstairs. But as the nights passed, the figure reappeared with unwavering consistency, always in the same place, always at the same window. Each night I would wait, heart thudding quietly in my chest, straining to see any movement beyond the outline of that form. The figure never waved, never moved abruptly. It simply watched, or seemed to. And the calmness of its posture made it all the more unsettling, as if it had been standing there for years, patient, waiting for me, or for someone like me, to notice. I tried to speak to someone about it once, casually mentioning it to a neighbor. "There's someone in that window," I said, careful not to sound hysterical. She gave me a puzzled look. "Are you sure?" she asked. "It's just the upstairs light. The house has been empty for years." I nodded, pretending to agree. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. My memories of the house as a child, the curtains moving without reason, all of it came rushing back. The figure was a continuation of that same quiet presence I had sensed before. It was deliberate, patient, and impossibly still. One evening, I decided to approach closer, careful not to alert anyone, though I didn't know who or what might be inside. I walked along the cracked sidewalk, keeping my gaze fixed on the window. The figure was there again, exactly where it had been the night before, pale against the dim glow. My stomach tightened, and I felt the pull of some instinct I couldn't name, a mixture of fear and fascination that I could not resist. I stayed across the street, unable to move closer, unable to look away. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something else, faintly metallic, almost like old iron. The figure didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't breathe in any way I could perceive, but the intensity of its gaze made it feel alive. I thought back to the stories I had heard from neighbors over the years, rumors of the house, of the man who vanished decades ago, of people who had been drawn to the property and never left. I remembered the entries in the old guest book I had discovered during my travels, the notes left by those who had stayed and seemed content never to leave. Could this figure be the same? A remnant of that long-vanished presence, a memory frozen in time, now visible to me alone. Nights passed and the pattern continued. Every evening the pale figure appeared unchanging. I began to notice small details. The angle of its head, the stillness of its hands pressed lightly against the glass, the way it seemed almost to acknowledge me across the distance without moving. It was not threatening exactly, but its presence was heavy, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I started keeping notes, drawing sketches of the figure from memory, trying to understand its consistency, its permanence. There was something in the way it occupied the window, something patient and watchful, that made me feel as if the house itself was alive and had adopted this figure as its sentinel. Sleep became difficult. Even when I closed my eyes, I would see that pale shape against the glowing window, unmoving, patient, waiting. I could almost hear the quiet rhythm of its presence, a slow, deliberate heartbeat that seemed to echo from the walls of the house itself. One night I tried to approach the house again, moving quietly along the yard, imagining that if I could just see closer I might understand. But as I neared, the figure did not move, and yet a chill rose along my spine that made me retreat. It was as if moving closer would break some invisible rule, some boundary I was not meant to cross. I began to feel as though the figure was aware of me in a way that went beyond observation. It watched my patterns, my routines, my movements across the street. And each night, as I returned to my own home, the image of that pale man remained etched in my mind, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I realized then that the house, the light, and the figure were all connected. The house had waited for decades, patient and unyielding, and now it had someone to witness its presence, someone who could not look away. I did not know if the figure was human, a memory, or something else entirely. But its constancy, the deliberate stillness, and the quiet awareness it carried made it impossible to dismiss. And as I stood across the street, watching the pale man in the window, I understood with a sinking, slow dread that I had become part of its observation. That somehow, by noticing, by acknowledging its presence, I had stepped into the story of the house, and into the careful, unending vigil of the man in the window. I didn't expect to feel anything at all when the demolition crew finally arrived. Years had passed since I had last stared at that house across the street, since the pale figure had haunted my evenings, and the windows had glowed with that impossible light. I thought distance and time would erase the memories, soften the edges of that unease that had lived in my chest for decades. But the moment I saw the wrecking equipment rolling onto the lot, a chill ran through me, sharp and uninvited. I watched from my old bedroom window, the same one I had pressed my face against as a child. The crews were methodical, breaking the house down piece by piece, walls toppling, beams cracking under the weight of the machinery. Dust swirled in the golden afternoon sunlight, catching in the trees, drifting slowly toward my yard. It smelled faintly of old wood, earth, and something else I couldn't name. Something faintly metallic, faintly familiar. The workers moved with purpose, but I couldn't stop my eyes from lingering on the second-floor windows. I half expected to see the pale figure standing there, watching me one last time. Of course, there was nothing. The house had been reduced to rubble over decades, abandoned, silent, or so I told myself. Hours passed, walls fell, and the crew worked steadily. That's when one of them, a young man in a faded flannel shirt, called out, "Hey, you might want to see this." I walked slowly down the street toward the site, my legs heavy, heart pounding with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. When I arrived, I saw that they had uncovered a section of the wall from the side of the house facing my bedroom window. It had been hidden behind layers of paneling and old plaster, long forgotten and sealed away. Inside the wall was a small cavity, and inside that cavity was something wrapped in what looked like yellowed cloth. One of the workers carefully pulled it free. I stepped closer, squinting, and my stomach dropped. It was a doll, not a child's toy in the cheerful sense, but a pale, almost lifelike figure crudely fashioned. Its skin was faded, cracked, and the eyes, small, black, and bead-like, stared without blinking. Its head was tilted slightly, and it seemed to occupy a posture that mimicked standing, as if it had been posed to look out a window. I froze. The memory of the pale figure from all those nights flashed through me, sharper and more vivid than ever. The same long nights I had spent pressed against my bedroom glass, watching the glow in the upstairs window, watching the figure that had always seemed so alive, so deliberate. It had been staring at me. And now I realized this object buried in the wall had been placed there intentionally, purposefully, directly facing my bedroom window. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't seem to fully grasp what it meant. To them, it was probably just a curiosity, some artifact left behind by a long-forgotten occupant. But I knew better. My chest tightened, a cold pressure settling deep in my bones. That doll, or whatever it was, had been positioned to watch me. I remembered the nights of my childhood, the curtains moving, the shadows shifting, the strange awareness that someone or something was observing me. And I realized with a creeping horror that made my limbs heavy that it had been watching me all along. Not from the window itself, not from the second floor of the house in the traditional sense. From inside the very structure, behind the wall, in a hidden cavity, it had been placed there to witness, to mark my presence, to remind the house, and whatever it contained, that someone was noticing. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, slow and deliberate. The dust swirled around us as I stood frozen, staring at the pale figure now free from its hiding place. My mind ran through the decades of memories, the glow in the window, the figure at night, the feelings of being watched. Every instance, every subtle unease suddenly made sense. The house had been patient, observing quietly, waiting for the right person, and it had chosen me. One of the workers nudged the doll with a boot, and I felt a surge of nausea. It was lifelike enough that the action made it seem almost animate, as if it recoiled, even though I knew it could not. I leaned closer, inspecting the face, the tilted head, the subtle, almost imperceptible details that mimicked life. And in that instant, the hair at the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't just the house or the doll. It was the connection between them. The doll had been a sentinel, a marker, a reminder. And for decades, it had been perfectly still, perfectly patient, while I slept, while I lived, while I looked away. The realization weighed on me heavily. I felt the slow, sinking dread of knowing that some part of my past had been deliberate, intentional, orchestrated in a way I could not have understood as a child. The house had watched me, not in the fleeting, passing way I had imagined, but with purpose. Every shadow, every shifting curtain, every quiet pause in the night, an extension of the eyes hidden in the walls. I didn't know whether to laugh at the absurdity or cry at the horror. The workers, oblivious, carried on around me, moving pieces of rubble, joking quietly. But I felt a strange isolation, a knowledge that what I had seen, what I had felt for so many years, was not imagination. It had been real, too real. I stepped back, my eyes lingering on the figure one last time before letting it be carried away by the crew. The air felt heavier after that, laden with the weight of decades of observation. I knew the house was gone now, but the memory, the intent, the deliberate vigilance, the feeling that I had been watched, would stay with me forever. And even as the walls fell and the dust settled, I couldn't shake the certainty that the house, in some way, had not just watched me. It had marked me. It had remembered. And perhaps, somewhere deep in the quiet, patient parts of the world, it was still watching. I remember the first time I laid eyes on the Holloway estate. From the outside, it looked like a crumbling monument to something long forgotten, a monument to wealth and tragedy frozen in dust. Its gates hung crooked, the iron rusted in intricate curls that had once looked delicate, now jagged and jaggedly dangerous. The lawn was overrun, wild grass and thorny weeds twisting around the cracked stone walkway, and the trees leaned toward the house like silent sentinels. I had heard stories before I ever stepped foot on the property. They said the estate had been abandoned suddenly, decades ago, after a murder, one that had left the family scattered, the house empty. No one had dared live there since. The town kept its distance, but I was drawn to it anyway. The promise of decay, the secrets locked in every shuttered window, called to me with that irresistible mixture of curiosity and dread. I climbed over the gate, careful not to make noise. The metal groaned under my fingers, protesting the intrusion, and I froze for a moment, listening. Nothing but the wind moving through the trees, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and old wood. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, its windows like eyes staring back, unblinking and cold. The front doors were massive, carved from oak and scarred by time. I pushed against one, and it swung open slowly, groaning, revealing a hallway coated in dust and shadows. The air inside was thick, heavy, and carried a faint metallic tang like iron or dried blood, though I wasn't sure which. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, falling in narrow beams onto the marble floors, highlighting the remnants of a life that had long since vanished. Every step I took echoed loudly in the vast space, bouncing off walls decorated with peeling wallpaper and faded portraits. I could almost hear whispers beneath the creaks of the floorboards, memories of people who had lived here, laughed here, argued here, and vanished here. I could imagine the sound of footsteps, not mine, moving softly in rooms I had yet to enter, and I felt a shiver crawl across my skin. The house was massive, each room larger than a normal house in its entirety. Chandeliers hung from the ceilings like skeletal fingers, coated in dust and cobwebs. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floors, a sofa torn open, chairs overturned, books spilled like leaves after a storm. I ran my fingers along a carved mantel, feeling the grooves of craftsmanship that had been abandoned, neglected. There was a beauty here that was undeniable, even in decay, and yet it was overshadowed by a suffocating presence I could not ignore. I made my way toward the main staircase. The wood creaked ominously under my weight, each step threatening to give way entirely. Upstairs, the hallways stretched far beyond what I expected, lined with closed doors, each one holding its own silence, its own secret. Some doors were ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms frozen in time. A child's broken toy, a nightstand with a decaying lamp, wallpaper curling in long, yellowing strips. I paused at one door, slightly open, and caught a whiff of something unmistakably human, though long decayed. A faint mixture of dust, earth, and something that reminded me of old perfume. I stepped closer, careful, and pushed the door gently. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a bedroom that had clearly belonged to a woman. The bed was stripped to the springs, the floor littered with remnants of clothing and personal items, and a mirror hung crookedly on the wall, reflecting my figure back at me in the dim, filtered light. The more I explored, the more I felt that weight pressing down on me. The estate itself seemed alive, breathing slowly, watching carefully. Each room held a memory, a fragment of tragedy suspended in dust and shadow. I imagined the family, once lively and present, now gone, leaving behind only the echoes of their lives. And yet, there was a sense that the house had not completely let them go, that perhaps it kept something, or someone, waiting in the corners where my flashlight did not reach. I wandered deeper into the mansion, drawn by curiosity I could not quell. The library was vast, shelves reaching to the ceiling, books thick with dust, some fallen, their pages yellowed and brittle. I pulled one gently from a shelf, and a photograph slipped out. A family portrait carefully posed, frozen in black and white. I studied their faces, trying to reconcile the liveliness captured there with the silence and decay around me. There was something wrong, an absence, a shadow behind the father's shoulder that seemed almost out of place. My stomach tightened. I moved on, exploring corridors and rooms, my flashlight cutting through darkness. Every step made me more aware of the sounds. The subtle creak of floorboards not directly under my feet, the whisper of wind through broken windows, the soft settling of the house as though it were adjusting to my presence. It was impossible to shake the feeling that I was being observed, that some part of the house, or something within it, was tracking me as I moved. Eventually, I found myself in the main ballroom. The ceiling soared high above me, painted in murals that had cracked and faded, the edges peeling like curling skin. Chandeliers hung precariously, crystals dull with dust, and in the center of the floor a large stain marred the once polished wood, a dark, irregular shape, long dried, almost unrecognizable but somehow familiar. My throat tightened and I swallowed, the metallic tang in the air stronger here. I could imagine the moment it had been made, the screams, the panic, the silence afterward. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping the room. In the corners, shadows seemed to cling, darker than the surrounding dimness, and I felt the unmistakable weight of eyes on me. The house had been empty for decades, yet it felt full, alive with memory, with presence, with watching. I moved toward the door, careful not to trip over debris, heart pounding, mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. And as I left the ballroom, ascending toward the upper floors again, I realized something about the Holloway estate that chilled me more than the decay, the shadows, or the smell of long dead wood. This house had not simply been abandoned. It had been waiting for someone like me to enter, to witness, to stir the quiet air that had held decades of silence and tragedy. And now that I was inside, it was watching. I stepped carefully down the hallway, each footfall echoing softly against the cracked wooden floors. Dust rises with every step, catching the pale light that filters through the broken windows, turning it into a haze that hangs heavy in the air. The house feels alive here, quiet but watchful, as if it knows where I'm going, guiding me toward something it wants me to see. I turn a corner and notice a door that seems different from the others. The wood is darker, smoother, less scarred by time, as if it has been maintained or polished long after the rest of the mansion was left to decay. I hesitate a moment, hand on the knob, listening for any sound beyond it. Nothing, except the faint creak of the house settling. I push it open slowly. Inside, the room is unlike any I've seen in the estate so far. Mirrors cover nearly every surface, some leaning against walls, others mounted in ornate frames. Each is thick with dust, making their surfaces cloudy and gray, yet I can still make out shapes and faint reflections. They all face in the same direction, toward the far corner of the room. I step inside cautiously, the floorboards moaning beneath me. The light from the windows outside is dim, but the mirrors catch it and scatter it in strange, fractured ways. For a moment, I feel disoriented, as if I've stepped into a place where gravity and direction are uncertain. My reflection is repeated dozens of times, each one slightly delayed, slightly distorted, like echoes of me that aren't quite right. I blink, trying to shake the feeling, and see that something about the room seems to resist my presence, as though it has been expecting me. I move slowly toward the center, trying to understand the arrangement. All the mirrors face the far corner, and I follow their line of sight. At first, it seems empty, just more dust and shadows. But then I notice a subtle shift, a change in the way the light falls. One of the reflections seems wrong. It doesn't mirror me perfectly. I tilt my head, blink again, and see it more clearly. A figure, pale and still, standing just beyond the range of the other mirror's reflections. My heart starts to beat faster. I turn in the direction the mirrors face, but there's nothing there. Just shadows, broken furniture, and dust. I look back at the mirrors and the figure is closer now, or maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Each time I glance away and then back, it seems to have moved closer, always just out of reach, always reflected but never directly visible. I step toward the corner, careful not to rush. The air feels heavier here, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic and unmistakably human. I imagine the history of this room, why someone would have placed mirrors all facing a single point. The arrangement is deliberate, almost ritualistic, designed for observation, for watching, for capturing a presence. and I feel it keenly. The room is watching me back. I move around the mirrors slowly, noticing more details. Some of them are cracked, small spiderweb fractures that make the reflections distort in unsettling ways. A reflection of my arm bends oddly, as if detached from my body. The figure appears again in a different mirror, always in the corner, always pale, always still. I cannot see it directly, only through the fractured glass. A sudden thought strikes me, sharp and cold. This room has been waiting for someone to enter, someone to look into the mirrors, someone to become the observer. Perhaps it has always been meant to trap attention, to hold it, like the house itself has been watching all these years. The more I study the mirrors, the more I feel myself drawn in, unable to look away, my reflection fracturing and duplicating into infinity. I notice writing faintly etched into one of the mirrors near the floor, half hidden under dust. I kneel slowly to read it. The words are almost illegible. He sees, he waits, he follows. A shiver moves down my spine. The figure in the corner, the one only visible in reflections, feels closer now, almost aware of me noticing. I glance around the room quickly. Nothing. Only the mirrors and the way each reflection seems to stretch the shadows, elongate them, fold them in unnatural ways. I take a step backward and the floorboard creaks. The figure flickers across the mirrors, just a movement at the edge of perception, and I feel a chill run through me. The room, with all its dusty, cracked mirrors, feels like a trap. It's not just reflections, it's memory, it's attention. It's something patient and unseen that has been using these mirrors for decades to watch, to track, to mark whoever enters. I try to remind myself I'm alone, that it's just an abandoned room, mirrors, and my imagination. But I cannot shake the feeling that every movement I make is recorded, echoed back in the glass. Every breath, every subtle sound, every heartbeat seems magnified, multiplied, reflected in ways that are just slightly off, just slightly wrong. I linger for a moment, staring into one of the larger mirrors, and I see it. The figure is there, taller now, standing in the corner beyond the reflected edges of the room. Its face is pale and unreadable blank, but the eyes are dark, unblinking, fixed on me through the glass. I step back quickly and it's gone, except in the mirrors where it remains, patient and unmoving. I realize then that leaving this room won't erase the memory of what I've seen. The mirrors will keep it for me. Every glance I take from now on, every reflection I encounter will carry a shadow of this place. And though I step toward the door, my feet heavy, the feeling lingers. That figure, unseen yet ever present, is watching through the mirrors. Waiting, patient, eternal. I exit slowly, leaving the room behind, but the reflection of the corner and the pale figure that watches from within it will stay with me, imprinted on my mind, long after I've gone. The Holloway estate has many rooms, but this one with its mirrors feels alive. It waits, and I know somehow that it always has. I remember holding the camera, its weight oddly comforting in my hands, a barrier between me and the strange quiet of the Holloway estate. I had returned to the mirror room, drawn by a mix of fascination and unease I couldn't shake. The dust hung in the air like a fog, swirling gently with every motion. Light from the cracked windows fell in pale streaks across the floor, bouncing faintly off the mirrors that filled the room. It was silent, but the silence pressed in on me, thick and patient. I set the camera on a tripod, careful to capture the way the mirrors faced the far corner. The lenses reflected the room in strange, almost disorienting angles. I adjusted the focus, watching my own movements multiplied across the glass surfaces, echoing infinitely like ripples in still water. I tried to steady my breathing, aware of how loud it seemed, and began filming slowly, deliberately, each click of the camera's controls sounding unnaturally sharp in the hushed room. I moved to stand near the center of the room. The mirrors reflected me endlessly, showing me from every conceivable angle. I tilted my head, examining the way the reflections fractured and bent the light. Something about the arrangement unsettled me, an order to the chaos that felt purposeful. I felt watched, not by the lenses, not by the camera, but by the very air around me, as if the room itself were conscious. I stayed still, almost motionless, focusing on the recordings, and then I saw it. One of the reflections shifted. Just slightly at first, a subtle movement like a shadow adjusting in the corner. My eyes darted between the mirror and my body, my pulse quickening. I had not moved, not an inch. I stood frozen, feeling the chill creep along my spine. My own reflection stared back at me, motionless. But the mirror, it wasn't me. Not entirely. Something within it moved independently, an impossible motion that my mind tried and failed to rationalize. I took a cautious step closer to the mirror. The reflection followed, but again I had not moved. My heart pounded, my breath shallow. I blinked, forcing my mind to rationalize what I was seeing. Shadows, tricks of the light, maybe a delayed reflection, yet no matter how many times I looked, the movement repeated, subtle but undeniable. The corner of the mirrored wall where all the reflections converged seemed to shift toward me, slow, deliberate, patient. I lowered myself onto the floor slightly, trying to capture a wider angle with the camera. The movement became clearer. Not a figure, not fully formed, but a bending of space, a ripple, a distortion within the glass. It wasn't me. It wasn't anything I could name. And yet it felt aware, watching, like it had been waiting for me to return, to stand still, to notice. My hands trembled and I reached for the camera to zoom in. The reflection seemed to recoil, then stretch, elongating in ways that no human body could. A faint whisper brushed the edges of my hearing, almost beneath the hum of the camera. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was deliberate, patient, an echo of something human but distant, something that belonged here. I stepped back instinctively, but the reflection continued its impossible movements. Every motion was slight, imperceptible from a distance, but under the lens, every change became sharp, undeniable. It was a rhythm, a slow, creeping motion, like a hand waving underwater or a shadow sliding along a wall. My pulse thundered in my ears. I forced myself to breathe, grounding in the reality I could touch. The cold wood under my palms, the dust rising in soft clouds around me, the smell of old, stale air. I realized then that the mirrors were not just reflecting the room. They were holding it, bending it, amplifying it. The reflections were more than glass. They were windows, vessels for something patient, something that had lingered here for decades, unnoticed. And it was curious now, curious about me. About the way I moved, about the stillness I tried to maintain, about the fear creeping into my skin. I shifted my gaze to the far corner again. The reflection had moved closer to where I was standing, though my body had not budged. It wasn't a person. Not entirely. More like a distortion, a shape pulled from memory, half-formed, pale and silent, stretching into the light of the camera. I felt exposed, like a performer under scrutiny, and yet I could not tear myself away. My eyes were drawn in, compelled to watch as the impossible unfolded before me. I pressed the record button harder, letting the camera capture everything. My breathing became slower, forced, methodical. I tried to study the distortion, to understand its rhythm, to discern some logic in the impossible. But the more I observed, the more it seemed to react. A subtle tilt of the head, a stretch of a form in a way I could not have moved. It watched through the glass, through the lens, through me, patient and relentless. Time seemed to stretch. Seconds elongated into minutes, and I lost track of how long I had stood there, entranced and terrified. The reflection moved again, subtly, like a slow tide of shadow. I felt an acute sense of vertigo, a deep awareness that the room and its mirrors were not just objects, but entities. They had memory. They had patience. They had been waiting for someone to return, for someone to witness, for someone to notice. A faint scratching echoed from one of the mirrors, almost imperceptible. My hand shook as I reached for the camera, pointing it toward the shifting reflection. The whispering was there again, closer now, almost teasing, but I still could not understand the words. It was deliberate, like an invitation or a warning. My skin prickled, my pulse thrummed, and I felt the weight of countless eyes, all focused on me through countless reflections. I stepped back again, heart hammering, mind racing to rationalize. But the reflection continued its impossible, subtle dance. I was standing still, I was breathing slowly, I was alive, and yet in the mirrors something else moved. Something patient, something waiting, something that had lived here far longer than anyone should have, observing everything, waiting for me to see. I left the camera recording on the tripod and stepped out of the room slowly, backward, keeping my eyes on the shifting mirrors. The reflection didn't vanish. It followed, subtle, almost polite in its persistence, stretching along the glass, bending, reaching. I closed the door behind me with hands that shook uncontrollably. The sound echoed down the hallway, swallowed by the vast emptiness. And I knew, even as I fled down the corridor, that the Holloway estate was no longer just abandoned. It had noticed me. It had learned that I was curious, that I was patient enough to watch. And somewhere in that room, among the dusty mirrors and impossible reflections, it waited, patient, eternal, unblinking, and it would not forget. I remember the road first, long, narrow, and swallowed by darkness. My headlights cut through the night in weak cones of yellow, illuminating only a few feet in front of me at a time. The GPS had gone blank about 10 miles back, insisting I was off route, but the address on my delivery manifest was clear. The road wasn't on any map I had, and yet here I was, following a path that seemed to stretch into nothing, lined with trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The air was thick and still, almost alive, pressing against the windshield. I told myself it was just night, just quiet, just the isolation of being far from the city. The hum of the engine and the soft thrum of tires on asphalt were my only companions, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was ahead, something waiting. Then I saw it, a house at the dead end of the road. Its windows were dark, but the outline of the structure was unmistakable. 2 stories, steep roof, and a porch that sagged under years of neglect. The paint had peeled away like curling skin, and the yard was overgrown, the grass so tall it brushed against the tires as I stopped. I killed the engine, letting silence fall, and sat staring. I had no recollection of seeing this place on any previous routes, nor had I ever delivered here before. And yet, my manifest insisted this was my stop. I stepped out, the cold air biting at my face. The road behind me had vanished into darkness, leaving the house isolated, framed by the trees and the night sky. It felt detached from the world, a pocket of stillness that had never existed on any map. I moved toward the porch slowly, each footstep stirring dry leaves and snapping twigs beneath my boots. The wood creaked under my weight as if reminding me that it was still alive in some way. I noticed the front door was slightly ajar, a faint gap in the warped wood. No welcome mat, no signs of life, no mailbox, just a dark, open doorway that invited me in, or dared me to enter. My hand hovered near the doorframe as I glanced back at my van. It seemed safer in there, familiar, connected to the world. But the package in my hand weighed heavy, and I reminded myself that I was only doing a job. Stepping inside, the air changed immediately. It was cooler, thick with the smell of mildew, old wood, and a faint metallic tang that made my stomach tighten. The floorboards groaned under my weight, sending small clouds of dust into the faint beams of light from the windows. The house felt immense, larger than it appeared from the outside, rooms stretching in directions I didn't expect. I moved slowly down a narrow hallway, scanning each room as I went. Furniture was draped with yellowing sheets, and in the dim light, everything seemed oddly distorted, like the house had shifted while I wasn't looking. I noticed scratches along the walls, shallow but deliberate, tracing patterns I couldn't make sense of. Some marks looked old, some recent. My pulse quickened. Had someone been here recently? I set the package down on a table in what seemed to be the living room. The air was still, almost waiting. A faint draft whispered along the floor, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke, though there were no chimneys lit. I rubbed my arms, feeling the chill, and realized that the house was silent in a way that wasn't just the absence of sound. It was intentional, heavy, as if it were listening. I continued exploring, moving cautiously from room to room. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, curling at the edges, each pattern warped and twisted in the shadows. I passed a staircase leading to the second floor, and I swear I felt a presence above me. Not a figure, not a shadow, just awareness. The hair on my neck prickled, and I found myself unconsciously holding my breath. When I reached the kitchen, I noticed a sink filled with murky water, as if someone had left it running long ago. Cups and plates were stacked neatly on the counters, covered in layers of dust. It was absurd, almost theatrical, like a scene frozen in time. And yet I felt as if someone had stepped away just minutes ago. I shook my head, telling myself it was my imagination. I was alone. I had to be. I returned to the living room to retrieve the package, noticing for the first time a set of footprints in the dust. Not mine. Smaller than mine, almost childlike, leading from the back door to the staircase. My stomach churned. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone. The footprints ended at the base of the stairs, leading upward, but nothing moved. The house groaned around me as if in response, a low, shifting sound like a sigh or a warning. I told myself I would just leave, just place the package down and get back to the van, back to the familiar lights and streets. But my feet felt heavier, reluctant. Something about the house made moving feel unnatural, like it wanted me here longer than I intended. I glanced at the windows. The road behind me had vanished into shadows, trees forming a wall of darkness that seemed to isolate the house entirely. Even the moonlight didn't reach past the branches. I was trapped by my own curiosity, my own footsteps, by the knowledge that this house wasn't meant to be found so easily. I set the package on the table finally, stepping back slowly. My eyes swept the room, and in the corner, half hidden by shadows, I saw it, a figure, pale still, watching from the edge of the hallway. I froze, heart hammering. My rational mind screamed that it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the window, but my gut told me otherwise. I wanted to call out, to move, to leave, but no sound emerged. My voice felt swallowed by the house itself. And then the figure vanished, not walking away, not fading, but gone as if it had never existed beyond my mind's edge. I grabbed the package and fled, my boots thudding against the floorboards, out the doorway, down the narrow road. The headlights caught the edge of the house one last time before darkness swallowed it again. When I reached the van, I looked back, but the house had disappeared almost entirely into the night, existing more in memory than in reality. Driving away, the road stretched endlessly behind me, no sign of the dead end, no indication the house had ever been there. My pulse slowed, but the image of that pale figure, still and patient at the edge of the hallway, lingered. I delivered the package eventually, but I never found the road again. And sometimes, when I drive late at night on unfamiliar streets, I swear I see a faint light flickering between the trees at the edge of my vision, calling me back to a road that never existed. I remember the way the air shifted as I moved deeper into the house. It was thicker now, almost damp, carrying the scent of old paper, polished wood, and a faint, metallic tang that I couldn't place. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, its narrow beam trembling slightly in my own unsteady hands. Each step on the floorboard seemed louder than the last, though the house itself remained eerily still. That's when I noticed them, framed on the walls, leaning against shelves stacked atop each other in dusty piles. Photographs, black and white sepia, even a few in the faded color of early prints. They were everywhere, and as I bent to examine the nearest stack, I realized the first, most striking thing about these pictures. They all showed the same family. At first glance, it seemed normal. A mother, father, 2 children, a small, typical family. But then I looked closer. The photographs were taken over decades. I could tell that from the changing clothing styles, the faint differences in the backdrop, the shifting grain of the paper. And yet, the family didn't seem to age, not a day older. The little girl in a 1920s dress looked the same in a photo from the 1970s. The father's stern expression never softened, never bore the marks of time, no wrinkles, no graying hair. The mother's smile was always the same, gentle and small, unchanging across years, across decades. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My rational mind tried to explain it. Maybe it was an unusual coincidence. Perhaps the photographs had been touched up, printed from the same originals over and over. But the more I looked, the more the impossibility pressed in. There were pictures of birthdays, holidays, weddings. I even found one taken outdoors in winter, snow falling around them, and yet the children looked identical to the photos from the summer in bright dresses and bare feet. I picked up a photograph from a pile on a small, warped table. The edges were brittle and a layer of dust clung to the surface. The father's eyes seemed to catch the dim light of my flashlight. I swear I felt them following me, or maybe I just imagined it. My hand shook slightly as I held it closer. The mother's smile felt familiar, though I had never seen her before. And the children, my mind refused to name them, stood like shadows, the same posture, the same gaze, the same impossible stillness. I carried the stack into the living room, or what I assumed was the living room, and laid them across the old rug. The dust rose in faint clouds with each movement. I noticed the fireplace cold and empty, with soot darkening the bricks, and the shadows of the photographs stretched long across the walls, like the figures were pressing outward from the images themselves. I told myself to breathe, to remind myself I was alone, and yet a part of me felt that I was not. As I flipped through the images, I noticed small details repeated across time. The same chair in the corner of the room, the same lamp, the same patterned wallpaper. Some photos were taken in different rooms, some outdoors, but objects appeared again and again, almost as if the house itself refused to change. My pulse quickened. It was like looking at a family frozen in time, caught in a cycle I could not understand. I stopped on one particularly worn photograph. The children were older in this one, teens, standing in front of the same house that I now explored. And yet, the house in the background looked identical to the house I had entered, untouched by weather, decay, or time. The boards were the same shade of gray, the windows the same height, the ivy crawling along the walls exactly as it had decades earlier. It was impossible, and the faces, they hadn't aged at all. A sudden creak made me jump. My flashlight swayed as I turned toward the sound, expecting to see a loose floorboard, a branch scraping against a window, but there was nothing. Only the photographs, staring back at me, accusing, patient. I could almost hear the faint rustle of paper, as if the images themselves were shifting slightly, adjusting to my gaze. I shook my head, forcing myself to take another breath, focusing on the task at hand. I moved deeper into the house, following a narrow hallway that seemed to appear as I passed through the living room. Along the walls, more photographs were mounted, carefully arranged. They were chronological, or at least I thought they were, showing the family from infancy to adulthood, and yet they remained unchanged. It was unnerving, like watching a time lapse of someone's life where the hours, days, and years had simply stopped. I noticed one picture in particular, set in a hallway that looked much like the one I now walked. The little girl was staring directly into the camera, her eyes dark and wide. And then I realized she wasn't just looking at the camera. She was looking at me. My stomach tightened, my hands cold against the frame. The more I stared, the more the sense of being observed grew. I wanted to step back, to put the photograph down, to run, but my curiosity pinned me in place. I moved cautiously to a table covered with more images. Here, the father was alone in one, standing in a doorway that seemed familiar. I recognized the angle. It was the front hall of this house. The photograph's date was stamped decades ago, and yet the door, the molding, the way the light hit the walls, everything matched exactly. I reached out to touch it, my fingertips brushing the faded edges. The photo felt warmer than it should, almost pulsing faintly, though I could not tell if it was real or imagined. The more photographs I examined, the heavier the atmosphere became. Each one seemed to carry weight, the invisible pressure of countless years compressed into an instant. And sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I thought I could see movement. Not in the photographs themselves, but a shadow, a shift of something just beyond the frame, a whisper of fabric or a presence brushing past the edge of perception. I told myself it was fatigue, that staring at so many images late at night had made my mind play tricks, but the unease was too vivid to ignore. I found a photo of the family gathered around a table for dinner. It was not a posed photograph, more like a candid moment, capturing laughter, motion, and warmth frozen in an impossible instant. The shadows cast by the chandelier fell in the same pattern as the shadows currently stretching across the ceiling above me. And for a heartbeat, I thought I heard faint laughter, the soft, warm sound of a family enjoying a meal, though the house remained silent. I dropped the photograph and it fluttered to the floor, sliding slightly across the dust. The sound echoed, far too loud in the stillness. I stepped back, heart pounding, and realized I had been holding my breath. When I exhaled, it was loud to me, like a shout in an empty hall. I looked around, scanning the dark corners. Nothing moved, nothing except the photographs. They were still, but their presence felt heavier, almost tangible. I noticed something I hadn't before, small differences in the images that I couldn't explain. A chair slightly closer to the wall in one photograph, a lamp angled differently, a shadow cast just so. And yet the people always the same, never changing, never moving except in frozen smiles, silent expressions. It was impossible, unnatural, and my mind refused to accept it. I felt drawn to the staircase at the far end of the hallway, a room I hadn't explored yet. Photographs lined the walls leading up, frames placed carefully along the banister. As I ascended, I realized the images were getting newer, or at least newer in appearance. The children now appeared as adults, standing in the very hallway I now climbed, but their faces still unchanged. Their eyes seemed alive, aware, and for a fleeting moment I thought one of them blinked. I reached the top landing where the photograph stopped. The hallway ahead was dark, empty, but I felt it, the weight of eyes, patient and unblinking. I turned back to the wall of photographs I had just climbed past, and for the first time I felt the full force of it. They weren't just images. They were watching, waiting, anchored to the house in a way I could not understand. I stepped back carefully, nearly tripping over the edge of a loose floorboard. My hands shook. The photographs had changed subtly as I looked away. In one, the little girl from the first photo now stood in the doorway behind me, just a shadow at the edge of perception. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly. Nothing. Only dust motes floating in the beam of light, the silence pressing against me. I realized then that I couldn't stay. Not in this house, not with these photographs starring, waiting, impossibly unchanging. I gathered the few I had left in my hands, not daring to touch more than necessary, and moved back toward the main floor. Every step felt heavier, the air thickening with every breath. The house seemed to hum faintly around me, the whispers of a past I could not understand pressing against my ears. I left them there, all the photographs, stacked neatly, almost reverently on the table where I had first seen them. And as I stepped out into the night, closing the door behind me, I glanced back once. Through the dusty window, I could have sworn I saw the family, standing in the shadows, smiling at me in silence. And though I never returned to that house again, the memory of those unchanging faces, their eyes fixed and patient, has haunted me ever since. Even now, when I look at old photographs, I sometimes catch a flash of familiarity, an impossible smile, a shadow in the corner, a presence that should not be. I remember the hollow weight of that house, the air thick with decades of stillness, and I understand in some part of me that some things refuse to move forward in time. They linger, they watch, they wait. And I know, in the quietest moments, that they are still there. I thought leaving that house would be the end, that the weight of its silence, the eyes frozen in photographs, would stay behind with the walls, the dust, the shadows. I drove away that night, my hands tight on the steering wheel, feeling the chill of the autumn air creeping through the cracked window of my old truck. The road seemed longer than usual, stretches of black pavement flanked by trees that arched overhead like skeletal fingers. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sounded louder than it should have. I told myself it was just nerves, just the memory of the house pressing against my mind. I reached home and dropped onto my bed, exhausted. I couldn't sleep, though, not fully. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the little girl's smile, the father's unwavering stare, the mother's gentle but unchanging expression. I tried to reason it away. Old photographs, some strange coincidence, nothing more. But a sense of unease settled into my chest, heavy and stubborn. The next morning, I thought I could put it all behind me. I had work to do, errands, the mundane rhythm of life. Yet, something drew me back to the photographs in my truck, the few I had held onto, the ones I had picked up in a haze of curiosity and fear. I reached for the stack without thinking, my fingers brushing over the brittle edges, and that's when I noticed it. It wasn't immediately obvious. The photographs seemed the same as I remembered. The family frozen in time, the little girl always looking toward the camera, the father unmoving, the mother's small smile. But then my gaze settled on one of the earlier pictures, the one I had handled most carefully, the one taken in the hallway leading upstairs in that old house. My stomach dropped. There among the family was someone new, someone who hadn't been there before, and my heart refused to let me look away. It was me, my own face pale in the dim light of the photograph, standing at the far end of the hallway. The way I held myself, my posture, my expression, it was exactly as I had been the night I left. Not a trick of memory, not a reflection of the photograph itself. It was me, captured impossibly, alongside a family that should have long since been gone. I dropped the photograph, hands trembling, and it fluttered to the floor. Dust rose in a soft cloud, particles catching the morning light that filtered through my curtains. I stared at the remaining photographs in the stack. Some of them subtle changes now. Shadows where there had been none, slight movements in the corners, and always the sense that someone or something was aware of me, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that the fatigue and the strange aura of the house had left me seeing things. But the more I looked, the less rational my thoughts became. One by one, I flipped through the images. There I was, present in different photos, sometimes standing in doorways, sometimes leaning against walls, sometimes just in the background. My presence was subtle at first, almost a shadow among shadows, but it was unmistakable. And then came the worst part. In the photograph taken in the living room of the house, I was in the same spot I had stood when I had last held the picture of the little girl. My eyes, wide in shock, seemed to reflect the same dread I felt now. And for the first time I understood. The house hadn't let me go. Not really. My visit, my curiosity, my touch of the photographs, it had anchored me in some way to its walls, to its rooms, to the family that refused to age. I sank to the floor, back pressed against the edge of the bed, and tried to breathe. The photographs seemed heavier in my lap, though I hadn't moved them. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, passed through the pages. I could feel it in my fingertips. The images were no longer just still pictures. They were alive in some small, impossible way. They adjusted, they watched, they marked me as part of them. That night, sleep didn't come. I kept the photographs on the nightstand, unwilling to put them away, unwilling to discard them. I needed to see them, to understand them, even as every rational part of me screamed to burn them, to throw them in a river, to never, ever look back. And yet there was a magnetic pull, subtle and persistent. The next morning I dared to examine the photographs again. I noticed other small changes. The little girl's head tilted slightly toward me. The mother's eyes seemed to track my movements across the room. The father's hands, folded in every picture, shifted minutely, as if adjusting to accommodate my presence. And in each photograph where I appeared, I seemed smaller, younger, more like a shadow of myself rather than a living man. I started researching. Old property records, newspaper archives, anything that might explain the house, the family, the impossibility of the photographs. I found fragments, brief mentions of disappearances, of people vanishing near that rural road where the house had stood. And though none of the stories matched exactly, the pattern was there. People disappearing, houses abandoned, time standing still in small corners of the world. Yet nothing prepared me for what happened that night. I awoke to a faint sound, soft at first, like the rustle of clothing against wood. I thought it was the wind. I told myself it was the wind. But then I heard it again, more deliberate, moving closer. My eyes fluttered open and I saw the faintest movement at the edge of the room. A shadow. I froze. It wasn't a human figure. Not entirely. It was taller than I was, but disproportionate. And though it didn't move toward me, it hovered as if studying me, inspecting me. And in its shape, I saw the contours of the house itself, the hallways, the staircases, reflected and distorted. And then, impossibly, I felt the weight of countless eyes. Those photographs, those faces, all watching me from the walls, from the shadows, from somewhere beyond the room. I realized in that moment why the family never aged, why the house lingered long after the world had moved on. It was not the family that haunted the house. It was the house that consumed them piece by piece, year by year, visitor by visitor. And now it had me. I tried to leave the room, but my legs felt heavy, reluctant. My hands clutched the photographs tightly, as if letting go would mean leaving myself behind. The shadow shifted slightly, acknowledging my fear, confirming my place. I understood then that some curiosities were not harmless, that some houses, some families, some photographs were traps, waiting patiently for the unwary. Morning came eventually. I don't remember sleeping. I only remember waking, still clutching the photographs, still alive and still changed. My reflection in the mirror seemed off somehow. The edges of my face slightly blurred, the light catching my eyes in a way that made me think they were not entirely mine. I cannot return the photographs. I cannot throw them away. And I cannot explain why they include me now, why I am part of that unending cycle. But I know beyond doubt that the house, the family, the photographs, they are connected to me, and I am connected to them. In ways I do not fully understand, in ways that are both terrifying and permanent. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at the photographs, at my younger self among the family. I cannot help but notice that in each new image, I appear closer to the foreground, clearer, more alive. And I know somewhere deep inside that if I stay too long, if I linger on my curiosity, if I continue to look, I will disappear as they did. My life will fold into the photographs. My presence will become permanent, unchanging, part of the house's strange, impossible memory. I learned my lesson the hard way. Curiosity is dangerous. Some houses are better left alone. And some photographs should never be seen, never touched, and certainly never taken home. But even as I write this now, I feel it. The weight of those eyes, patient and unblinking. And I cannot escape the knowledge that they are waiting for the next glimpse, the next mistake, the next soul who thinks they can leave without being marked. You shouldn't stay too long.